Hello friends, how are you feeling tonight? I hope your body is relaxed and your mind is calm. If sleep feels far away, this story might help you drift gently into rest. Tonight, we're traveling back to a time long before cities, long before kingdoms rose and fell, to a world carved into the cliffs and bathed in desert light. We're journeying into the heart of the ancient American Southwest, where an extraordinary people once built a civilization among the canyons, the mysterious and majestic Anasazi. They left behind silent stone dwellings that cling to canyon walls, vast ceremonial chambers hidden beneath the earth, and a legacy that still whispers through the mesas and winds of time. Who were they? How did they live in such harmony with a harsh landscape? And why did they vanish, leaving behind cities of stone, perfectly preserved, yet forever empty? Tonight, you'll walk their paths, feel the warmth of their fires, hear the echoes of their ceremonies, and uncover the secrets of a people who shaped one of the most breathtaking civilizations in North America. So, lie back, take a deep breath, and let your thoughts drift through time as we explore the lost kingdom of the Anasazi. If you enjoy journeys like this one, stories that blend history, mystery, and calm, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to tell me where you're listening from. Now, let's begin our story. The desert remembers everything. Every whisper of wind, every footprint lost to sand, every stone shaped by ancient hands. In the far reaches of the American Southwest, where mesas rise like sleeping giants and the air tastes of salt and dust, time moves differently. Here, the past never truly fades. It lingers in the shadows of canyons, in the soft echo of wind brushing across sandstone walls, in the faint outline of homes abandoned 1,000 years ago. When the sun begins its slow descent, the desert changes color as if breathing with the earth itself. Gold melts into crimson, then fades to a deep violet haze. The rocks seem to hold their own light, glowing softly long after the sun disappears beyond the horizon. In that hour, as the wind stills and the shadows stretch, it feels as though something ancient stirs beneath the surface, something that has watched countless generations rise and fall. They called them the Anasazi, the Ancient Ones, a name given centuries later by the Navajo, who spoke of them with reverence and mystery. No one truly knows what they called themselves or why they vanished, but their world remains scattered across the desert. Silent cities of stone carved high into the cliff's spiral carvings that mark the passage of the sun, and pottery, whose painted patterns still seem to move when caught by flickering firelight. In this landscape, it is easy to forget the present, to stand on the edge of a canyon and feel the weight of centuries pressing softly against your chest. The air carries the scent of rain that has not yet fallen, and far below, a hawk circles over a dry riverbed that once flowed with life. Every grain of sand has witnessed something: a child's laughter, a prayer whispered into dawn, a tribe setting out to find new land beneath the summer stars. Before cities rose in the east, before the great cathedrals of Europe touched the clouds, there was Chaco Canyon, the heart of a civilization, now known only by what it left behind. Long roads that lead nowhere, walls built with impossible precision, and kivas, deep ceremonial chambers where firelight once danced across painted faces. Here, generations of Anasazi gathered under skies wider than imagination. They built homes not of conquest, but of rhythm and balance, guided by the turning of the stars. But all of that began much earlier, in a time when the desert was not yet so dry, when rivers whispered through the valleys and the people followed them, hunters first, then farmers, slowly learning to coax life from a land that offered little mercy. They planted maize and beans and squash, the sacred trio that would sustain them for centuries. They watched the sky for signs, the flight of birds, the color of clouds, the silence before a storm. Their survival depended on understanding the will of the world around them. They built small villages from clay and reeds, their walls glowing red beneath the sun, their fires burning through the cold, desert night. Over time, those villages grew, their homes pressed close together, forming the first hints of community, of belonging. They began to trade: obsidian from the mountains, shells from distant seas, feathers bright as sunrise. Through this exchange came stories, songs, beliefs, and a shared sense that their lives were part of something vast and mysterious. Generations passed, and the Anasazi began to build upward, stone upon stone, layer upon layer, as though reaching for the heavens themselves. Their architecture was unlike anything else on this continent. Walls aligned with solstices, doorways cut to capture light at sacred moments of the year. They measured time not by written calendars, but by the slow shifting of shadows. In their world, science and spirit were not divided, they were one and the same. At night, when the fires dimmed and the stars emerged, the desert turned into a mirror of the sky. Constellations stretched across the heavens like woven cloth. The people would sit in silence, watching, listening, feeling themselves part of the great breath of creation. They believed that the stars were ancestors, that their light was not distant, but alive. A reminder that all life was connected, that the spirit of one became the strength of another. The Anasazi were not a single tribe, but a constellation of communities, spread across mesas, valleys, and hidden cliffs. Some lived in open plains, tending crops by day and sleeping beneath woven mats by night. Others carved their homes into canyon walls, creating entire villages suspended between earth and sky. Each dwelling told a story, not of kings or battles, but of endurance, cooperation, and devotion to the rhythms of nature. Their lives were marked by ceremony, rain dances beneath thunderclouds, harvest feasts filled with laughter and smoke, chants that rose like wind spirals toward the stars. The Great Kiva, the sacred chamber, stood at the center of each village, a circle carved into the earth, where people gathered to speak with the unseen, to honor the forces that gave and took life. When the drums began to beat, it was said the ground itself began to breathe. Even now, centuries later, those places still seem alive. If you stand quietly within the ruins of Mesa Verde, you can almost hear faint echoes, the soft rhythm of hands grinding corn, the laughter of children chasing shadows, the distant hum of a flute carved from bone. The desert may have reclaimed the people, but it has not forgotten their touch. Archaeologists will tell you about their tools, their pottery, their engineering, about how they carried water across miles of barren land and built stone cities aligned with the cosmos. But none can explain the feeling that lingers here, a presence that hums just beneath the surface of silence. It is not a ghost, nor a memory, but something deeper, older, as though the desert itself remembers them and refuses to let go. When the night deepens and the sky becomes a sea of stars, the canyons shimmer with moonlight. Shadows gather in doorways once filled with fire. Somewhere in that stillness, you might imagine a voice carried by the wind, a whisper in a language lost to time. It speaks of the first builders, of children born beneath constellations, of dreams carved into stone, and of a people who vanished, leaving behind only the breath of eternity. The desert remembers, and through its silence, it tells us that nothing truly disappears. That every stone, every grain of sand, every broken shard of pottery is a story still being told. A story that began long before we arrived and will continue long after we are gone. And so the night deepens over the mesas. The wind moves softly through the canyons, and somewhere far away, beneath the blanket of ancient stars, the lost kingdom of the Anasazi sleeps, waiting to be remembered once more. For centuries, the great desert lay undisturbed. The winds passed freely through its valleys, carrying whispers across ancient stone. But no human voice broke the stillness. The world had changed, kingdoms had risen and fallen across oceans, and yet here, among the cliffs and canyons of the American Southwest, time seemed to hold its breath. The ruins of the Anasazi stood in patient silence, their walls untouched, except by the slow march of wind and rain. Bats slept in shadowed alcoves, and lizards darted across the remains of doorways once alive with laughter. The desert had kept its secret well. Then, in the late years of the 19th century, curious wanderers began to arrive. Trappers, explorers, ranchers, men searching for land or adventure. They rode on horseback through lands still largely unmapped, guided only by the stars and the advice of the native peoples who knew these canyons by heart. To them, the ruins were not unknown. The Navajo and Pueblo tribes had spoken of them for generations. They called the ancient builders Anasazi, meaning the ancient ones, or sometimes enemies of the ancestors, depending on the tongue that spoke the word. The name carried both reverence and caution. These were not spirits to be disturbed lightly. When the first settlers stumbled upon the ruins at Mesa Verde, they were overwhelmed by what they saw. The discovery was almost accidental. A few ranchers searching for stray cattle followed their herd up a steep canyon wall and found themselves standing before an immense city carved directly into the stone. The structure rose in terraces, with hundreds of rooms, some still intact, others filled with centuries of sand and silence. It looked as if the inhabitants had only just left, as if the fires had been extinguished yesterday. The men stood in awe, their voices hushed, as though afraid to wake the ghosts that slept within those walls. Word spread quickly through the territories. More expeditions followed, some driven by curiosity, others by greed. Archaeologists, both professional and amateur, began to uncover similar sites. Massive complexes hidden in cliff faces, dwellings perched on impossible ledges, and subterranean chambers filled with pottery, tools, and remnants of a vanished world. They found ladders still leaning against walls, corn cobs preserved by the dry air, and grinding stones worn smooth by generations of hands. Each discovery deepened the mystery. Who were these people? Where had they gone? And why had they built such magnificent cities only to abandon them? In the growing towns of the late 19th century, newspapers carried tales of the lost cliff dwellers. Painters and photographers ventured into the canyons, capturing images that astonished the wider world. The public marveled at the scale of the structures, the symmetry of their design, the beauty of their pottery. Some imagined a lost race, an ancient civilization erased by time or divine punishment. Others, more grounded, suspected that the builders were ancestors of the Pueblo peoples who still lived nearby, their traditions preserving echoes of a distant past. To many, the ruins seemed almost mythical, proof that the desert itself held hidden chapters of human history still waiting to be read. The early archaeologists faced immense challenges. The terrain was harsh, the weather unpredictable, and supplies scarce. Yet they pressed on, climbing dangerous cliffs and crawling through narrow passages to reach hidden chambers. Some sites could only be accessed by rope or makeshift ladders, suspended hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. Within these ancient homes, they found murals painted in red and ochre, geometric designs etched into plaster, and sacred symbols whose meanings were long forgotten. Each artifact told a fragment of the story, yet none revealed the ending. Among the most important discoveries was Chaco Canyon, deep in what is now New Mexico. At first glance, it appeared to be a series of stone ruins scattered along the valley floor. But as archaeologists mapped the site, they realized they were looking at something far greater, a network of cities connected by long, straight roads, stretching across vast distances with mathematical precision. These were not mere villages. They were ceremonial and cultural centers, carefully aligned with celestial events. The people who built them had possessed a sophisticated understanding of engineering and astronomy. The realization transformed everything scholars believed about pre-Columbian North America. Still, for all their knowledge and artifacts, no one could fully grasp the human side of the story. Beneath the layers of stone and dust lay lives once vivid with color and sound. Families who had sung to the dawn, who had planted corn and watched it grow beneath the relentless sun. Children who had played in courtyards, their laughter echoing through the canyon walls. Women who had shaped pottery with quiet patience, etching into each vessel patterns drawn from the rhythm of wind and rain. Elders who had gathered by the fire, telling stories of creation and the spirits that moved unseen through the night. These lives had vanished, yet traces of their existence lingered in every room, every broken shard, every grain of sand. As the 20th century dawned, excavation became more systematic. Teams of scientists documented every artifact, measured every wall, and tried to reconstruct the sequence of events that led to the Anasazi's disappearance. They studied pollen grains, animal bones, and ancient corn kernels, piecing together the climate and diet of a people long gone. They traced trade routes that stretched as far as Mexico and the Pacific coast. Turquoise, shells, and macaw feathers found in the ruins proved that the Anasazi were part of a vast network of exchange, connected by trails that crossed deserts and mountains. This was no isolated culture, but a vibrant civilization with art, faith, and order. Yet for all their progress, the archaeologists soon learned that understanding the Anasazi meant listening to more than just science. The Pueblo peoples, descendants of those who came after, spoke of the ruins with deep respect. They told of migrations guided by spiritual visions, of the search for balance between humans and nature. To them, these places were not lost cities, but living spirits, homes of ancestors who had completed their journey and returned to the earth. The ceremonies, still practiced in modern pueblos, echoed the same prayers once whispered in the great kivas of Chaco and Mesa Verde. The line between past and present was not broken. It had simply changed shape. Some scholars dismissed these oral traditions as myth. Others began to see their wisdom. The more they listened, the more they realized that the Anasazi story could not be told through excavation alone. It was written in the alignment of stars, in the seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest, in the wind's slow carving of stone. It was a story of endurance, of adaptation, of harmony and eventual loss. And within it lay a message as old as civilization itself, that nothing built by human hands lasts forever, and that balance with nature is as fragile as the desert bloom. In time, the ruins became protected sites. Mesa Verde was declared a national park in 1906, ensuring that the ancient dwellings would be preserved for future generations. Visitors from around the world came to walk the narrow paths, to stand before the same stone walls that had stood for nearly a millennium. Some came seeking history, others seeking silence. Many left with a feeling they could not quite describe, a quiet sense that the place was still alive, that its spirit lingered in the warm air and the shifting light. As the years passed, technology advanced and new methods of study emerged. Archaeologists used satellites and drones to map the full extent of the ancient roadways. They discovered alignments so precise that even modern instruments marveled at the builders' skill. Some paths led to sacred mountains, others to distant settlements, all part of a vast spiritual landscape that extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. The Anasazi had not been primitive or forgotten. They had been masters of their world, architects of both stone and meaning. And yet, one question remained, haunting every discovery. Why did they leave? Why would a people capable of such beauty, order, and wisdom abandon their cities and vanish into history? The answer lay hidden beneath centuries of sand and silence. It would not come easily, for it was not just a story of drought or migration, but of the delicate relationship between humankind and the land it depends upon. The desert, in its quiet way, knew the truth. But the desert never speaks, it only remembers. As the wind rises again through the canyons, the footprints of explorers fade just as the ancient ones did. The ruins remain, timeless and unmoving, guardians of secrets that resist explanation. And so, even now, when the twilight deepens and the last light touches the cliffs, one can almost feel those footprints again. Faint impressions in the dust, reminders of all who came before and all who tried to understand them. In that lingering stillness, past and present become one. And the story of the Anasazi continues, not through words or discoveries, but through the breath of the desert itself. By the 10th century, the Anasazi world was changing. The people who once built their homes on open mesas began to move into the cliffs, carving entire cities into the sheer rock faces that overlooked canyons and valleys far below. It was a time of both triumph and transformation, when the ingenuity of their ancestors reached its height, and the great stone dwellings that would one day astonish explorers began to take shape. The air was still dry and thin, the same sun beat down from the same pale sky, but the hearts of the people were filled with ambition and reverence. They had learned how to shape stone, how to weave the walls of their homes into the very bones of the earth, how to live between earth and sky in places that seemed impossible to reach. The decision to build among the cliffs did not come all at once. It began as a whisper, an idea that took root among the elders and the craftsmen. The open plains had become less safe. Tribes from beyond the horizon had started to appear, sometimes trading, sometimes taking what they wanted. The rains had become less predictable too, falling hard in one place and never at all in another. In such uncertain times, the people looked upward, toward the protective embrace of the canyon walls. They found natural alcoves, where the wind and sun had hollowed out great shelters in the sandstone, and they saw potential, safety from enemies, shelter from storms, a place where the whole community could live together close to the spirits that watched from above. Families began the slow, patient work of carving homes. They chipped at the stone with harder stones, using wooden beams and stone hammers. It was grueling labor, each stroke echoing through the cliffs like a heartbeat. They worked from sunrise to sunset, cutting rooms one by one, leveling floors, shaping doorways just wide enough for a person to pass through sideways, to keep out the cold and the wind. They built ladders from branches and yucca fibers, and slowly, year after year, the first cliff dwellings took shape, small at first, then larger, until they became entire towns. From a distance, these new homes looked like the nests of giant birds, tucked into the cliffside. But inside, they were worlds of warmth and life. The walls were smoothed with clay plaster, sometimes painted in soft reds and whites. The air smelled faintly of cornmeal and smoke. Fires burned low in stone hearths, their light flickering across the walls as children played and women wove baskets by the glow. In the evenings, the sound of flutes drifted through the canyons, haunting and beautiful, echoing against the stone until it was impossible to tell where it came from. At the center of each settlement stood the kiva, a circular chamber built below ground where the people gathered for ceremonies and for council. The kiva was sacred, a symbol of their origins, a reminder of the underworld from which their ancestors had first emerged. To enter it, one climbed down a ladder through a small opening in the roof, leaving the world of light behind for a moment of quiet darkness. There, beneath the earth, they prayed to the spirits for rain, for health, for balance. They sang old songs and told the stories that connected one generation to the next. The story of the Great Migration, the story of the Corn Mothers, the story of the stars. Life in the cliffs was difficult, yet deeply connected. Every member of the community had a role to play. The women tended the fields on the mesa tops, where they grew corn, beans, and squash. The three sisters that sustained their people. The men hunted deer and rabbits in the valleys below, tracking their prey by the marks left in the dust. Children learned to grind corn on heavy stones, to weave reeds into mats, to climb the steep paths that led home. The elders sat in the shade, watching, remembering, guiding. It was a society built on cooperation, on the shared understanding that survival was only possible together. Water was precious, more valuable than any gem. The Anasazi learned to read the land like a sacred text, to see where the rainwater would flow and where it would hide. They carved small channels to direct the runoff from storms, built reservoirs to catch every drop that fell, and stored it carefully in clay jars sealed with pitch. In the dry season, they would walk for miles to fetch water from distant springs, singing as they went to keep their spirits strong. Each sip was a prayer, a connection to the earth itself. Over time, the cliff dwellings grew into great complexes. Towers rose between rooms, their purpose partly defensive, partly ceremonial. Pathways and stairways connected one level to another, creating mazes of stone and shadow. Some of the largest dwellings held hundreds of rooms, sheltering entire clans. From high above, a lookout could see for miles, across canyons, across mesas, all the way to the distant mountains. It was a place of both refuge and pride, where the people could live with the sky at their fingertips and the land spread endlessly below. Despite the harshness of their world, there was beauty everywhere. The walls of the canyons glowed in shades of orange and gold as the sun passed overhead. At dawn, the sky burned with color. At night, it was filled with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The people watched the movement of the heavens with careful eyes. They noticed how the sun rose and set in different places through the seasons, how the moon's light changed, how the stars circled endlessly around the pole. Some of their buildings were aligned with these celestial patterns, built so that light from the solstice sun would fall exactly through a doorway or a window, marking the passage of time with precision and reverence. Religion and daily life were one and the same. Every action, from grinding corn to sweeping a floor, was done with a sense of sacred purpose. The people believed that the world was alive, that the stones had memory, that the wind carried messages, that the ancestors walked beside them in every moment. When a child was born, the whole village gathered to sing. When someone died, they were buried close to the home they had built. Their spirit believed to remain nearby, watching, protecting. But as the cities grew, so too did the challenges. The desert was not kind, and even the most skilled hands could not control the clouds. Droughts returned, some lasting for years. The once reliable rains began to falter, and crops withered in the sun. Families rationed their food, sharing what little they had. Hunters traveled farther and farther, sometimes returning empty-handed. It was during these years that tensions began to rise. Some clans argued over water rights, others over hunting grounds. Stories of raids from neighboring tribes spread through the canyons like dust on the wind. Yet through all this, the Anasazi endured. They adapted, as they always had. They learned to store food in sealed rooms to protect it from pests, to trade with distant peoples for what they lacked, to rely on their community when the world outside turned hostile. They never stopped building, never stopped carving beauty into stone. Their walls still stand today, silent but strong, proof of the hands that shaped them and the hearts that refused to yield. In the glow of the setting sun, those walls seem almost alive, breathing in rhythm with the desert wind. Each doorway still opens to rooms that once echoed with laughter and song. Each kiva still feels sacred, filled with the quiet pulse of something ancient and eternal. And though their voices have faded into time, the spirit of the cliff dwellers endures, carried by the rocks, the wind, and the endless memory of the desert itself. The years that followed the building of the great cliff cities were years of wonder and growth, but also of subtle unease. For generations, the Anasazi had believed that harmony with the land brought protection, that balance kept the world whole. Yet by the 12th century, that balance began to shift. The rains, once faithful as a heartbeat, became uncertain. The rivers that once shimmered beneath the mesas thinned to mere threads of silver, then to nothing but dry beds of cracked clay. The cornfields grew brittle beneath a pitiless sun, and the songs that once rose in joy became prayers for survival. The people did not know it yet, but they were standing at the edge of a long drought, one that would last decades and change their world forever. In the beginning, they waited patiently. They had endured dry seasons before, and the elders taught that all hardship passed in time. The rain would come again, they said, when the spirits were ready. So the people made offerings at the kivas, scattered turquoise and cornmeal upon the ground, burned sage and whispered to the ancestors for mercy. In the stillness of dawn, they faced the horizon, chanting to the clouds that would not form. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still the skies remained an empty blue, unbroken and merciless. At first, the drought tested only their patience, but as years passed, It tested their faith. Families began to ration their grain, measuring each meal carefully. Children grew thin, and the fields cracked open like old skin. Springs that had flowed for centuries turned to dust. The women walked farther each day, carrying clay jars on their backs, searching for water in hidden crevices or under stones where moisture still lingered. Each drop they found was a treasure, guarded like a secret. The men, hardened by the sun, returned from long hunts with empty hands, their eyes shadowed by worry. Among the people, there was one man who began to speak of omens, a priest of the Kiva named Toba. He was old, with deep lines carved by sun and sorrow, and his eyes seemed to hold the reflection of the stars themselves. Toba had been a watcher of the heavens since his youth, a keeper of the sacred calendar. It was he who marked the turning of seasons, who read the dance of the sun upon the cliff walls, who interpreted the will of the spirits. One evening, as the last light of day slipped away, he gathered the elders in the great Kiva and spoke of what he had seen. "The sun," he said, "has changed its path. The balance is breaking. The clouds no longer listen to our songs, because our hearts no longer listen to the earth." His words fell heavy among the circle of elders. He spoke of dreams in which the corn turned to ash, and of a serpent spirit that coiled in the sky, waiting for the time to cleanse the land. "The people must remember who they are," he warned. "If we forget the old ways, the land will forget us too." Many believed him, some feared him, others called him a prophet of despair. Yet even those who doubted could not ignore what their eyes saw each day. The streams were gone. The trees that once shaded their paths stood grey and lifeless. The world was drying, and no one could say why. As the drought deepened, the Anasazi began to change their ways of life. Villages that had once been filled with laughter grew quiet. People migrated, searching for places where the soil still held moisture. Some traveled north toward the rivers, others went south into the valleys. The great cliff cities, once full of warmth and light, began to empty, their fires dimming one by one. Those who remained grew fiercely protective of their resources. Water was guarded, food stored in sealed chambers. Trade, once open and generous, turned cautious and strained. Yet, even in hardship, their spirit did not fade entirely. In the evenings, when the air cooled and the stars returned, families gathered around the hearth to share stories. The elders spoke of the first people who had emerged from the underworld, of the promise made between humankind and the earth, of how balance must always be kept. Children listened with wide eyes as the firelight danced on their faces, the stories filling them with both fear and comfort. "We are the children of the stone and the sky," the elders said. "As long as we remember that, the world will not forget us." Toba, the priest, continued his rituals with quiet devotion. Every new moon, he climbed to the highest mesa, carrying offerings of feathers, cornmeal, and water, precious water, drawn from the last of the sacred springs. There, under the endless sky, he would pray alone. "Grandfathers," he whispered, "show us the path back to balance. Let the rains return." But the clouds never answered. Sometimes in the distance, lightning would flash, only to vanish before a single drop touched the ground. The drought brought more than hunger. It brought fear. Strange lights appeared on the horizon, fires from distant clans, desperate or hostile. Travelers returned with tales of raids, of villages burned, of people disappearing in the night. Trust began to erode, even among old allies. The people of one canyon would no longer share food with those from another. Walls that had once protected families became barriers of suspicion. In these years of struggle, something shifted within the hearts of the Anasazi. They began to look inward, to their dreams and visions, for guidance. Art and ceremony took on darker, more urgent tones. Painted figures appeared on canyon walls. Spirals, serpents, suns, and human forms reaching toward the heavens. Some said these were prayers, others warnings. The once peaceful songs of planting became chants of endurance, the rhythm of survival echoing through the cliffs. Toba's influence grew as the drought worsened. People came to him seeking answers. He spoke of a prophecy that had been passed down through generations, a time when the people would forget the covenant of balance and the world would withhold its blessings. We were given corn, water, and sun, he said, but we have taken more than we have given. The earth remembers. She asks us now to remember too. One night, as the wind howled through the canyons, a vision came to him. He saw a great migration. The people leaving their cities, traveling toward the south, guided by a star that never set. He saw new lands and new beginnings, and he knew what it meant. The spirits were calling them to move on, to leave the homes they had carved, to find renewal elsewhere. But to tell the people this truth was to break their hearts. These cliffs were not just homes. They were their ancestors, their identity, their world. Still, the signs grew undeniable. The rains did not come. The stores of corn grew smaller. Children went to sleep hungry. And so, one morning, Toba gathered the elders once more in the kiva. "The time has come," he said. "The spirits demand our obedience. We must go." Silence filled the chamber, deep as the desert night. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, one by one, the elders bowed their heads. They understood. In the months that followed, preparations began. Families packed what they could carry: tools, blankets, seeds. They sealed the entrances to their homes with stone, as if tucking their ancestors in for a long sleep. They painted new symbols on the walls, spirals and hands, messages for those who might one day return. Before leaving, they lit fires in the kivas one last time and offered songs to the spirits. The voices rose, filled with both grief and hope, echoing through the canyon like the heartbeat of a people saying farewell. When they finally departed, they did so quietly. At dawn, the cliffs stood in silence as the lines of people moved across the desert floor, their figures small against the vastness of the land. Above them, the sun rose, blazing upon the empty dwellings that would soon fall to shadow and dust. The wind whispered through the doorways, carrying away the last traces of smoke, the last scent of life. The drought would continue for many more years, long after the people had gone. The great cities of stone would remain behind, hollow, haunted, beautiful. The desert would reclaim them slowly, with patience born of eternity. But their memory would not fade. Centuries later, when explorers and archaeologists would stand among those ruins, they would marvel at the mystery of the vanished people and wonder what had driven them away. The answer, whispered by the wind, would always be the same. The land remembers, and those who live upon it must listen. The morning they left the cliffs behind, the sun rose pale and cold, spreading its light across the mesas as if reluctant to wake the world. Smoke no longer rose from the hearths, and the canyons that once echoed with laughter and the rhythm of stone tools were silent now. Only the wind moved among the empty doorways, whispering through the hollow rooms like a spirit in mourning. The people had begun their long journey south, carrying with them the memory of a world carved into stone, and the hope that somewhere ahead, water and balance still waited. They walked in long, quiet lines, their feet stirring the dust of old trails that wound between red cliffs and dry washes. Men carried bundles of tools and baskets of seed. Women carried children wrapped in woven blankets, their faces pressed against their mothers' shoulders. The elders leaned on walking sticks, their eyes watching the horizon as if searching for the place where memory and prophecy met. Each step took them farther from the world they had built, but also closer to something they could not yet name. The promise of renewal that Toba, the priest, had spoken of in his visions. The journey was harsh. Days were filled with heat that shimmered above the ground like fire. The soles of their sandals wore thin, and the air burned their throats. At night, when the temperature dropped, they huddled together beneath the stars, sharing what little food and water they had. The desert sky was endless, filled with light so sharp it seemed to pierce the soul. The people took comfort in it, in the constellations that had guided their ancestors, in the stars that never faded no matter how dark the earth became. They believed the spirits traveled with them in those lights, leading them onward. Weeks turned into months, and still they walked. They crossed lands that no one among them had seen before. Great stretches of dry plain broken by canyons so deep they seemed to split the world in two. They followed riverbeds that held only traces of moisture, digging into the sand to find water hidden beneath. Sometimes, when luck favored them, a storm would sweep across the horizon, and for a brief, miraculous moment, rain would fall. The people would lift their faces to the sky, laughing, crying, drinking from the cupped palms of their hands. But the rain always passed too soon, leaving the land once more in silence. Toba walked among them, tireless despite his age. His hair, once black, had turned the color of bone, but his eyes still shone with the light of belief. He carried with him a small pouch filled with sacred cornmeal and turquoise, the symbols of life and spirit. Each morning, he would stop at the edge of their camp, sprinkle a pinch of the meal onto the ground, and whisper a prayer for guidance. "The path ahead is hard," he would say, "but the earth remembers those who walk with respect." His presence gave the people strength, even when hunger gnawed at their bellies and exhaustion bent their backs. As they moved farther south, the landscape began to change. The cliffs softened into rolling mesas, the dry scrub into grasslands where antelope moved in cautious herds. The air grew a little cooler at night, and the stars seemed closer. Small signs of water appeared, damp soil, birds circling in the distance, a trickle of a stream hidden beneath reeds. The people followed these signs, building temporary camps near whatever water they could find. For the first time in many seasons, they planted small gardens, just enough to test the soil. They watched anxiously as green shoots broke through the earth, delicate and fragile. It was not much, but it was life returning. In those early camps, children began to laugh again. Songs returned to the nights, soft and low, carrying across the plains. The women wove new baskets, decorating them with symbols of the journey. Spirals for change, hands for memory, stars for hope. The men hunted deer and rabbits, bringing back meat that tasted sweeter after so many hungry days. For a time, it seemed as though the prophecy might be fulfilled, that they might find a new home where balance could be restored. But the journey was far from over. As they continued south, new challenges appeared. The land, though greener, was not empty. Other peoples lived there, tribes who spoke strange tongues and watched the travelers from afar with wary eyes. At first, there was distance and suspicion, but slowly, cautiously, the Anasazi began to trade. They offered pottery, woven cloth, and stories of the northern cliffs in exchange for food and water. Some of these encounters were peaceful, even friendly, while others carried tension, like the stillness before a storm. In a few places, disputes broke out over territory, over game, over pride. It was a reminder that even in new lands, survival required diplomacy as much as courage. Toba warned them to tread carefully. "We are guests here," he said. "The spirits of these lands do not yet know our names." He led offerings to local shrines, adapting their prayers to honor the guardians of rivers and mountains they did not yet understand. His humility earned the respect of the southern tribes, and over time, small bonds began to form. Bonds of trade, of marriage, of shared hardship. The people of the cliffs slowly wove themselves into the fabric of this new world. Still, there were those among them who longed for home. In quiet moments, they would look northward, toward the mesas where their ancestors slept. They remembered the echo of flutes in the canyons, the glow of fires against the stone, the warmth of their kivas. Some wept in silence, their tears lost to the dust. "We left our souls in the cliffs," one woman whispered to Toba as they rested by a stream. He placed a hand upon her shoulder and said, "The cliffs are within you. As long as you remember them, they are never gone." Years passed as the migration continued. Generations began to turn over. Children who had been born on the journey grew into adulthood, knowing no other world but the trail. The old names for places faded from memory, replaced by new ones. The people still called themselves by many titles. The ancient ones, the people of the stone, the keepers of balance. But they were changing, becoming something new. Their pottery styles evolved. Their homes took on new forms suited to the land, and their songs began to carry the rhythms of southern winds. Culture, like water, was flowing onward, reshaping itself as it moved. Toba grew weaker with each passing season. The long miles had worn him down, though his spirit remained unbroken. One night, under a moon bright enough to turn the desert silver, he gathered the people around him. "My journey ends here," he told them softly, "but yours continues. You must carry what we have learned, the stories, the songs, the respect for the balance that binds all things. Promise me you will remember." They promised. And when he passed the next morning, they buried him beneath a mesquite tree, marking his grave with a spiral of white stones. The wind that day was gentle, carrying his spirit onward. After his death, the people traveled for several more years before they finally found a place where the rivers ran strong and the soil was dark with life. They built new villages there, open, sunlit, surrounded by fields. They planted corn again and watched it grow tall. They carved new symbols on rock walls, blending old and new, and in their ceremonies, they still spoke the names of the ancestors. Though they had left the cliffs behind, they carried the essence of their lost kingdom in their hearts. Centuries would pass, and the memory of their migration would become legend. The world would call them by new names: Pueblo, Hopi, Zuni, each a continuation of the same ancient spirit. And the ruins they left in the north would stand silent beneath the sun, waiting for another age to rediscover them. But for the Anasazi, the journey had never truly ended. It lived on in every stone, every song, every whisper of wind that swept across the desert, telling the story of a people who refused to vanish, who learned, again and again, how to begin anew. Night fell like a curtain of deep blue over the canyon, and silence spread across the land once ruled by the Anasazi. The wind that had howled through the day quieted to a low murmur, brushing through the brittle sage and whispering between the cracks of ancient stone walls. The air cooled swiftly, and the shadows deepened in the narrow valleys where once hundreds of clay homes stood glowing under torchlight. Now, only moonlight reached them, touching the edges of crumbling towers and tracing the outlines of forgotten lives. Far below, in the hollow of the canyon, a small expedition camp rested. The archaeologists who had come to uncover the secrets of the Anasazi slept restlessly, each stirred by the strange stillness of the night. But one, Dr. Sarah Whitmore, sat awake beside the faint glow of the embers, her journal open, her thoughts heavy. All day, her team had worked among the ruins, uncovering rooms sealed for centuries. Inside one, they had found a strange carving. A spiral surrounded by 12 human figures, their arms raised toward a symbol of the sun. Around it were small handprints, some faint, others freshly visible, as if time itself had refused to erase them. Sarah could not shake the feeling that the place was still alive, not in the way of the living, but with memory, with a consciousness that watched in silence. She looked toward the great cliff dwellings illuminated faintly by the moon, and for a moment she thought she saw movement, a flicker of light deep within one of the darkened windows. Her heart quickened. She knew there was no one there, yet something inside her stirred with curiosity and dread. Earlier that day, she had followed a trail of petroglyphs leading to a hidden crevice in the canyon wall. Inside, the air had been cooler, heavier. There she had discovered the faint outline of a human figure carved deep into the rock, and beneath it, the spiral again, this time surrounded by strange symbols resembling stars and flowing rivers. Her guide, an elder from the nearby Pueblo tribe, had stopped at the entrance and refused to enter. He had simply said, "That is the place where the breath of the ancestors sleeps," and turned away. Now, sitting by the fire, those words returned to her like an echo. She felt a soft tremor beneath her feet. Perhaps the wind shifting the stones. yet it felt deliberate, rhythmic. She closed her journal and stood, moving toward the edge of the canyon. The moonlight bathed the ancient city in silver, and as she gazed down, she imagined the sounds that once filled this place: laughter, songs, the hum of stone tools shaping life from the desert. She began walking toward the ruins, her boots quiet against the sand. The air smelled faintly of dust and juniper. The silence pressed close, almost tangible. As she entered the first dwelling, she brushed her hand along the walls. The clay felt warm, almost as if it had stored the memory of countless suns. In one corner lay fragments of pottery, painted with intricate lines, spirals, steps, and birds. She crouched and examined them, tracing the faded paint with her fingertips. A sudden draft passed through the doorway, carrying with it the soft murmur of voices. She froze. Sarah. It was faint, like a sigh carried on wind. She turned quickly, but no one stood there. Her breath caught. The canyon was still. Slowly she rose and stepped outside. Across the open plaza, she saw a faint orange glow flickering inside one of the higher chambers, the same place she had seen movement earlier. She hesitated, then began to climb. The stone steps were uneven and narrow, carved into the cliff itself. As she ascended, she could hear the distant sound of water, a drip echoing through the rocks. At the top, she reached the small doorway of the upper chamber. The light was gone now, replaced by deep shadow. She crouched and entered. The room was small, circular, with soot-stained walls. In the center stood a shallow pit, once a ceremonial fire circle. Around it, she noticed shapes drawn with ash, spirals again, but overlapping this time, like layers of time converging. Then she saw it, a small bowl placed at the circle's edge. Inside it lay something wrapped in faded cloth. She leaned closer, unwrapping it carefully. Within was a bundle of feathers, turquoise beads, and a fragment of pottery with a symbol carved into it. A sun surrounded by 12 dots, the same pattern. As she stared at it, her vision blurred for a moment. The room seemed to ripple, the air thickening. She blinked, and suddenly the chamber was filled with light. Not harsh, but warm, golden, as though 1,000 candles had been lit. Around her, figures began to appear. People dressed in woven robes, their faces calm, eyes bright. They moved in silence, tending fires, carrying vessels, speaking in soft tones. Sarah's breath hitched. She could hear their language, musical, rhythmic, ancient. One of them, an elderly man with a staff, turned toward her. His gaze met hers, and she felt no fear, only awe. "You have come to listen," he said, though his lips did not move. His voice echoed within her mind. "You seek what was lost, but what is lost cannot be found by digging in earth. It lies beneath the spirit, where time circles endlessly." She wanted to speak, to ask him what he meant, but her throat was dry. The vision shimmered like heat over sand. The man raised his hand, pointing to the spiral drawn in ash on the floor. "We followed the sun," he said, "and the sun led us home. But when the earth grew silent, we walked beyond the light." The scene around her began to fade, the golden glow dimming. The figures dissolved into smoke, leaving only the soft hum of the wind. She was alone again, standing in the cool darkness of the chamber. Her hands trembled as she looked down at the bowl. The artifact was gone. Only dust remained. The next morning, Sarah told no one of what she had seen. She only wrote in her journal, "They are not gone. They are the wind, the light, the silence between heartbeats." Her team continued to dig, uncovering more rooms, more relics, more fragments of a civilization that had vanished centuries ago. But Sarah knew now that the true story of the Anasazi was not buried in the ground. It was woven into the land itself, into the stones, the rivers, the endless desert sky. As the sun rose high over the canyon, the cliffs glowed red and gold, and the wind carried a faint whisper, not of the past, but of memory that never dies. Somewhere deep beneath the stone, the ancient ones still spoke, waiting for those who would truly listen. And so, in that vast silence, the legend of the Anasazi lived on. Not as ruins, but as a heartbeat echoing through the desert forever. By the time the migrating Anasazi reached the fertile valleys of the south, the world they entered was unlike the desert mesas they had left behind. Rolling plains stretched under skies that seemed broader than any they had known, dotted with rivers that sparkled like silver ribbons and groves of trees heavy with fruit. The land was rich, abundant, and yet unfamiliar. The people paused at the edge of the first river, staring at the water as if it were a mirror reflecting their own uncertain future. For generations, they had lived in stone, had built homes into cliffs and mesas, had traced the path of the sun across the sky. Now, they would learn to live with the land in a new way, open, expansive, and more vulnerable to the elements than the sheltering cliffs they had known. The first camps were built near the riverbanks. Families settled into temporary structures of woven reeds and sun-baked clay. Children ran through the fields, their laughter echoing over the water. The women planted corn, beans, and squash, watching the soil soak up the occasional rains and grow green and full. The men hunted deer and small game, mapping the land carefully, noting where water pooled, where the grass grew longest, where the predators roamed. It was a delicate balance. Survival depended on patience, observation, and respect for the rhythms of the land. The elders, though weary from the long journey, began to guide the community in ceremonies designed to honor both the old ways and the new. Kivas were built, small and circular, often dug into the earth like tiny sanctuaries. Inside, the people gathered for prayer and counsel, for teaching the children, for interpreting dreams and visions. The fires burned bright at night, illuminating faces lined with age and youth alike. Songs were sung to the stars, chants of gratitude for water, for food, for safety. The rhythm of their lives returned slowly, as though the land itself recognized their presence and allowed them to breathe again. Yet even in this new world, the shadows of the past lingered. The cliffs they had left remained in memory, etched into dreams and stories. Children asked of them, and elders told of the great stone cities, of the kivas carved into rock, of the spirals painted on walls as offerings to spirits. They spoke of the drought, of Toba, the priest who had guided them through the long migration. Each story carried lessons, the importance of balance, the need for humility, the truth that survival was not merely a matter of strength but of understanding, of listening, of remembering. As the seasons passed, the people began to adapt. They learned to read the rivers, predicting where the water would rise in floods and where it would dwindle in summer. They discovered new sources of food, wild berries, nuts, and roots that grew in abundance along the riverbanks. They refined their pottery, crafting jars and bowls that were not only functional but beautiful, painted with symbols of sun, river, and sky. They created tools shaped from stone and bone, weaving nets for fishing, building traps for game, carving intricate patterns into reed mats. Each innovation was a reminder that they were not just survivors, they were creators, shaping life with knowledge passed down through centuries. Among the people, a young boy named Kiva emerged with a curiosity and intelligence that set him apart. His eyes were always bright, observing, learning, questioning. He followed the elders into the kivas, absorbing their stories, memorizing their chants, tracing the patterns of the stars above. He watched the artisans at work, noting the way they mixed clay and painted designs, the rhythm of their hands. He wandered the riverbanks alone, feeling the pulse of the land in the water, in the wind, in the gentle sway of trees. Kiva would grow to be a bridge between the old ways and the new, a keeper of memory who understood that to survive in this land required both respect for the past and courage to embrace the unknown. The people's new settlements flourished. Structures of stone and adobe began to replace the temporary reed homes. Villages were laid out in careful patterns, plazas at the center surrounded by living quarters. The kivas became larger, some with multiple rooms, ceremonial platforms, and steps leading into the ground. In these spaces, elders taught the children how to honor the spirits, how to read the stars, how to respect the rivers and the mountains. Festivals marked the planting and the harvest, the solstice and the full moon, each one a link between their history and their present. Yet even as life stabilized, challenges remained. Rivers that nourished the land could also flood without warning, destroying crops and settlements. Wildlife could be unpredictable, and tensions with neighboring peoples occasionally flared. The Anasazi, now blending with other tribes in the region, learned the delicate art of diplomacy. They traded corn, pottery, and woven cloth for meat, shells, and other goods, building alliances that strengthened the new communities. Some families intermarried with neighboring tribes, weaving bonds that would endure for generations. Through it all, the memory of the cliffs remained sacred. The spirals, the handprints, the kiva ceremonies, they persisted in every new village, echoing the lessons of endurance, ingenuity, and reverence for the earth. The elders often reminded the children that their survival depended not on domination, but on harmony, that the land was a living entity, deserving of respect. Each river, each stone, each gust of wind carried the whispers of ancestors, and to ignore them was to risk imbalance once again. Over time, the new villages evolved into what would be recognized as early Pueblo settlements. The structures grew larger, built from adobe and stone, often multi-storied. Terraces and platforms were crafted along hillsides, following the natural contours of the land. Water management techniques became sophisticated. Canals directed runoff to fields, reservoirs stored precious rainwater, and irrigation channels ensured that even during dry spells, crops could survive. The knowledge carried from the northern cliffs was combined with local observations, creating a hybrid culture rooted in both memory and adaptation. Music, dance, and art flourished. Flutes and drums echoed in the plazas at night, their rhythms carrying across the river valleys. Dancers adorned with feathers, shells, and pigments moved in patterns that reflected both celestial bodies and ancestral stories. Pottery evolved into complex forms, with symbols that spoke of journeys, survival, and spiritual connection. Even the smallest basket or woven mat bore intricate designs, telling stories of migration, of life along the cliffs, of the ancestors who had walked through drought and desert. The legacy of the migration was profound. It was more than survival, it was transformation. The Anasazi had carried with them knowledge, ritual, and memory, embedding it into new lands, creating the roots of cultures that would endure for centuries. In the rivers, in the stones, in the adobe walls of the new villages, the echoes of the cliff dwellers remained. They were not lost. They had merely adapted, carried forward in spirit, ingenuity, and the relentless rhythm of life. As Kiva grew, he began to assume the role of teacher and guide. He would lead ceremonies in the kivas, interpret visions, and instruct children in both farming and survival. He told stories of the cliffs, ensuring that no generation forgot the origin of their people. His wisdom grew, bridging the past and the present, reinforcing the continuity that had allowed the Anasazi to survive centuries of change. Through his eyes, the children understood that their lives were threads in a tapestry of time, each action echoing forward, each choice shaping the future. And so, the southern valleys became home. The Anasazi, once cliff dwellers, now river settlers, had transformed hardship into knowledge, drought into innovation, loss into legacy. The deserts and canyons of their northern homes remained in memory, whispered in song and story, revered in ceremony, but the southern land offered life renewed. Here, amidst rivers and fertile soil, the seeds of a new world were planted, seeds that would grow into the Pueblo cultures, vibrant and enduring, carrying the spirit of the lost kingdom far into the future. The sun rose slowly over the river valleys, spilling golden light across fields of corn, beans, and squash. The air was filled with the fragrance of fertile soil, mingled with the smoke of morning fires. In these valleys, the Anasazi, no longer wandering cliff dwellers but settlers of a new world, began to create a life that fused memory, tradition, and adaptation. The land demanded respect, and the people had learned that survival was not merely physical endurance, but spiritual harmony. Every decision, every step, was guided by an understanding that the earth, the sky, the water, and the fire were all interconnected threads in the fabric of life. The kivas became the heart of the communities, circular, subterranean chambers. They were more than ceremonial spaces. They were schools, council halls, and sanctuaries. In the dim glow of firelight, elders taught children the sacred ways, how to trace the cycles of the sun, the moon, and the stars, how to honor the spirits of rivers, mountains, and animals, how to remember the cliffs they had left behind. The walls of the kivas were adorned with paintings and carvings, spirals, handprints, serpents, and suns, symbols carried from the northern mesas, now blended with local motifs, telling stories of journey, endurance, and hope. Among the people, a reverence for the land guided every aspect of life. Fields were rotated and shared, ensuring that no one plot was overused. Water was carefully collected and distributed, sometimes in communal canals, sometimes in clay pots stored for drought. Hunting was done with restraint. Every kill was honored through ritual and thanks. Even in times of abundance, waste was unthinkable. These practices were not laws imposed by rulers, but a culture of shared responsibility, passed from one generation to the next in stories, songs, and silent example. Music and dance became vital expressions of community and spirit. Drums, flutes, and rattles echoed across the plazas, accompanying dancers who moved in patterns inspired by the constellations, the flow of rivers, and the seasons of planting and harvest. Festivals marked the cycles of the year: the first planting, the ripening of crops, the harvest, the solstices. During these times, the air was alive with rhythm, song, and movement. Children learned to weave their own rituals into the larger ceremonies, understanding that they were part of an unbroken chain linking the past, present, and future. Pottery, once purely functional, became a canvas for storytelling. Women shaped vessels with care, painting them with symbols of sun, water, spirals, and animals. Each pattern had meaning, often layered with multiple messages that could be read by those who understood the language of memory. Bowls and jars were offerings to the spirits, gifts to the ancestors, and tools for daily life. The pottery of the Pueblo people retained the elegance of the northern Anasazi style, yet adapted to the new soil, the new pigments, and the aesthetic of the southern land. Architecture, too, evolved in response to necessity and culture. Villages were planned with care, balancing communal spaces with private quarters, protecting against the sun, the elements, and potential threats. Multi-storied homes rose from terraces and hillsides, their flat roofs serving as platforms for observation, storage, and ritual. Stone and adobe walls were thick, insulating against heat and cold alike. Rooms were connected by narrow corridors, often leading to the kiva at the center, a reminder that spiritual life lay at the heart of the community. Despite this flourishing, challenges remained. The southern rivers, though generous, were unpredictable. Floods could sweep through the valleys, destroying crops and homes. Predators lurked in the surrounding forests. Neighboring tribes brought both trade and tension. But the people were cautious and adaptive. Councils of elders guided decisions, balancing caution with initiative. Decisions were made collectively when possible, reflecting a social structure that valued consultation, wisdom, and consensus over authority. Spiritually, the Pueblo people were innovators as much as they were preservers. They combined the rituals of the northern Anasazi with new practices drawn from the land and neighboring cultures. Offerings were made not only to ancestral spirits, but to local river guardians, mountain protectors, and sky watchers. Songs invoked both memory and aspiration, calling forth the rains, ensuring successful harvests, and seeking protection from calamity. Vision quests became a rite of passage, guiding young men and women to confront their fears, understand the rhythms of nature, and connect with the guiding forces that shaped life. Kiva, now grown into a young man of wisdom and curiosity, became a central figure in this spiritual evolution. He traveled to the edges of the valley, observing patterns of the sun and river, listening to the whispers of wind through the trees. He documented the stories of the elders, preserving not only their teachings, but also the subtle lessons of survival. How to read the sky for storms, how to plant according to the movements of the stars, how to live in partnership with the land rather than domination over it. Children flocked to him, eager to learn, to touch the past while shaping the future. Trade with neighboring tribes strengthened the culture and ensured survival. Pottery, woven cloth, and salt were exchanged for meat, shells, and obsidian. Ideas flowed as freely as goods. New stories, songs, and techniques were incorporated into the Pueblo traditions. Yet even as they adopted new practices, the people never forgot the cliffs. Memory was a sacred thread woven into every action. Every song recalled the long migration. Every spiral painted on a vessel whispered of the northern mesas. Every ceremonial chant honored the drought that had forced them into this new life. Time passed, and the settlements grew into thriving communities. Children who had once played in the shadows of temporary reed huts now ran through plazas framed by stone and adobe. Their laughter filled the air with a resonance that echoed across the valleys. Elders watched with pride, knowing that the essence of the Anasazi, their ingenuity, spirituality, and resilience, had not been lost, but transformed. Every harvest, every festival, every ritual carried both remembrance and hope, bridging centuries and lands. The Pueblo people were no longer the cliff dwellers of the north. They were settlers of rivers and valleys, keepers of rivers and skies. Yet the spirit of the cliffs lived within them, as tangible as the stones beneath their feet, as real as the stars that guided them at night. Through architecture, ceremony, art, and song, they wove a culture that balanced survival with reverence, memory with innovation, human needs with the sacredness of the land. And in these valleys, beneath the sun and the vast sky, the legacy of the Anasazi endured. Their story of drought, migration, survival, and adaptation had become more than legend. It had become life itself, flowing through generations, whispered in the winds, etched into the stones, sung in the plazas, and carried in the hearts of all who walked the paths of the desert and the rivers. The seeds planted in the cliffs had taken root once more, sprouting in a new land, thriving in harmony with the earth, and giving rise to a civilization that would carry the echoes of the lost kingdom forever forward. Seasons came and went, each leaving its imprint on the river valleys where the Pueblo people had settled. The landscape changed with the rains and the sun. The rivers swelled and ebbed, and the fields of corn, beans, and squash stretched wider each year. Villages multiplied along terraces and hillsides, linked by trails winding through groves and along riverbanks. From a handful of small settlements, a network of communities emerged, each echoing the traditions of the Anasazi cliffs, yet adapting to the peculiarities of the southern land. The people had learned not only to survive, but to thrive, transforming the valleys into living mosaics of stone, earth, and spirit. Agriculture became more sophisticated. Canals diverted the flow of rivers to irrigate fields distant from the banks, storing water in reservoirs dug into clay-rich soil. Crop rotation was practiced to maintain fertility, and the people observed carefully the cycles of sun and moon, predicting droughts and floods with remarkable accuracy. Techniques learned from the northern cliffs merged with new methods discovered through experimentation and observation. Young men and women worked the land alongside elders, carrying knowledge forward while contributing their own discoveries. The connection between humans and earth deepened. Each seed planted was an act of faith, each harvest a celebration of harmony with nature. Villages grew not only in number, but in complexity. Multi-storied dwellings rose from the terraces, with flat rooftops used for drying food, observing the sky, or performing ceremonies. Central plazas served as meeting spaces, marketplaces, and venues for dance and ritual. Kivas multiplied, some subterranean, some partially above ground, each elaborately constructed with fire pits, benches, and niches for offerings. These sacred spaces became the beating heart of society, guiding the people spiritually, socially, and intellectually. Here, the elders taught not only the rituals of survival, but also the philosophy that had sustained the Anasazi through drought, migration, and upheaval, respect for balance, humility before nature, and reverence for the ancestors. Trade flourished. Trails connected the villages, linking the Pueblo people with distant tribes. Pottery, cloth, and ceremonial items were exchanged for obsidian, turquoise, and salt. Ideas traveled alongside goods. Stories of the cliffs, of long migrations, of visions and prophecies were shared with neighbors, creating a cultural network that strengthened alliances and enriched knowledge. With trade came negotiation, diplomacy, and occasionally conflict. Yet the Pueblo people approached each interaction with the lessons of the cliffs in mind: patience, observation, and respect. These principles prevented many disputes from becoming violence and allowed communities to grow in relative peace. The spiritual life of the people deepened alongside their material culture. Kivas were the sites of initiation, healing, and divination. Shamans and priests interpreted visions, performed ceremonies to bring rain, or guided souls to the afterlife. Festivals marked the turning of the seasons, solstices, equinoxes, the first planting, the harvest. Music and dance were central to these celebrations. Drums, rattles, and flutes echoed across the plazas, their rhythms mirroring the cycles of rivers, seasons, and stars. Dancers adorned with feathers, beads, and painted garments embodied the sun, the wind, and ancestral spirits, connecting the living with the eternal. Through these rituals, the Pueblo people preserved the memory of the cliffs, ensuring that each generation carried the wisdom of the Anasazi, even as life in the valleys evolved. Art remained a vital medium of cultural expression. Pottery became increasingly elaborate, decorated with symbols representing migration, fertility, celestial bodies, and sacred animals. Woven textiles incorporated geometric designs that conveyed both aesthetic beauty and encoded knowledge. Rock carvings and petroglyphs were added to cliff faces near settlements, serving as permanent reminders of ancestry and guidance for future generations. Every object, every decoration, carried layers of meaning, practical, spiritual, and historical intertwined. In these creations, the Pueblo people wove their identity, blending memory of the past with innovation born of necessity. Leadership evolved to match the growing complexity of settlements. Councils of elders, chosen for wisdom and experience, guided decisions affecting agriculture, water management, conflict resolution, and ceremonial life. Leadership was often fluid, shared among individuals and families rather than centralized. This structure reflected the Anasazi understanding that survival depended on cooperation, consensus, and respect for knowledge. It allowed villages to adapt to environmental and social changes while preserving cultural continuity. Despite these achievements, life remained fragile. Droughts returned, rivers occasionally shifted course, and food shortages tested the resilience of communities. Disease and conflict with outsiders threatened stability. Each challenge reminded the Pueblo people that success was contingent on vigilance, adaptation, and reverence for the forces that governed life. Yet their history of survival, the migration from the northern cliffs, the lessons of Toba, the persistence of memory, had prepared them. They faced adversity with careful planning, spiritual grounding, and communal strength. In this period of expansion, children were taught the dual lessons of innovation and remembrance. They learned to farm, hunt, weave, and craft, but they also learned to tell stories, read the signs of the land, and interpret visions. Each child knew the legend of the cliffs, of the long migration, and of the sacred spirals that had guided their ancestors. Through this education, The Pueblo people ensured that the culture of the Anasazi would persist not merely as memory, but as living practice embedded in every aspect of life. The legacy of the cliffs endured, transformed yet recognizable. Spirals continue to appear on pottery, in kiva walls, and on ceremonial objects, representing the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. Handprints marked walls as reminders of individual contribution to communal well-being. Ceremonial dances and songs incorporated melodies and motifs from the northern mesas, adapted to the rhythms of river valleys. Memory and innovation coexisted, creating a culture that was at once ancient and new, rooted in experience, yet ever adaptable. By the end of this era, the Pueblo people had established a civilization remarkable for its balance. They had transformed the southern valleys into thriving, interconnected communities, while maintaining spiritual and cultural continuity with the northern cliffs. They had survived drought, migration, and uncertainty, and in doing so had created a foundation for generations to come. Through agriculture, art, ritual, and social cohesion, they ensured that the Anasazi spirit, the knowledge, resilience, and reverence for balance, would live on, whispered in the wind, carried in the rivers, and etched into the stones of the earth. The people looked to the sky each night, tracing stars and spirals, remembering ancestors who had walked long before them. In every harvest, every festival, every construction of stone and adobe, the echoes of the lost cliffs persisted. The legacy of the Anasazi was no longer confined to ruins. It was alive in every river, every home, and every beating heart of the Pueblo communities, thriving as a living testament to human resilience, wisdom, and the sacred bond between people and the land. The valley stirred with the first light of dawn, a golden haze settling over terraced fields and adobe dwellings. Children ran barefoot across the plazas, laughing as women carried water from the river in clay vessels, their skirts brushing against the dust of centuries-old trails. Smoke from early fires twisted upward into the sky, carrying with it the scent of corn roasting and herbs burned in ceremonial preparation. Life in the villages had become a symphony of rhythm, necessity, and sacred observance, each movement tied to the cycles of sun, moon, and river. The heart of Pueblo life was not merely in the material, stone houses, fertile fields, or pottery, but in the spiritual fabric that wove communities together. Central to this spiritual world were the kachinas, the spirits of ancestors, animals, and natural forces. These spirits governed the rains, the fertility of the fields, the health of children, and the success of hunts. They were invoked in dances, songs, and ceremonies, performed within kivas and in open plazas. Kiva, now a young man of authority and insight, had begun to understand the intricate balance between the spiritual and practical realms. He had learned that survival depended as much on honoring unseen forces as on cultivating the earth. The ceremonies themselves were elaborate and deeply symbolic. During the winter solstice, entire villages gathered in kivas adorned with murals and carvings depicting celestial movements, mythic animals, and the ancestral spirals of the cliffs. Smoke filled the air as offerings of cornmeal, feathers, and small crafted objects were placed in fire pits and on ceremonial altars. Drums and rattles beat a rhythm that mimicked the heartbeat of the earth, and the dancers, dressed in elaborately carved masks representing kachinas, moved in patterns that told stories of creation, migration, and renewal. Each gesture, each step, had meaning. A silent language understood by all who participated, a bond between generations and the unseen forces they revered. Kiva observed these rituals carefully, noting the way the elders instructed the youth. The children were not mere spectators. They were participants, learning to embody the spirits through song, movement, and mimicry. They learned the stories of the cliffs, of the spirals that guided ancestors through drought and migration. They learned that the land, the sky, and even the wind were alive with consciousness. In these lessons, survival and spirituality were inseparable. To ignore one was to imperil the other. The kachina dances were particularly powerful. Masks representing rain spirits, sun spirits, and ancestral guides were meticulously carved from wood and painted with natural pigments. The dancers moved in harmony with chants that described the seasons, the rivers, and the distant cliffs. It was believed that through these dances, the Kachinas themselves were called into the world, bringing blessing, fertility, and protection. Kiva had once watched a dancer portraying the rain spirit move across the plaza. As he did, the wind shifted, a cloud appeared on the horizon, and the elders whispered that the ceremony had succeeded. Beyond the ceremonial life, Kachinas influenced daily survival. Farmers prayed to the spirits before planting, hunters offered thanks after successful hunts, and artisans created objects imbued with spiritual symbolism. Even the simplest basket, jar, or mat was more than functional. It was a vessel of connection, a bridge between the physical and spiritual realms. The Pueblo people understood that every act carried spiritual weight, a lesson learned through generations, from the cliffs to the valleys. Community life too was guided by spiritual principles. Elders convened councils not only to resolve disputes or organize labor, but to interpret visions and omens, ensuring that decisions aligned with the will of both ancestors and the forces of nature. Education was a blend of practical and spiritual knowledge. Children learned to farm and hunt, but also to read the signs in clouds, rivers, and stars. Social cohesion and survival were inseparable from spiritual observance, and this integration allowed the Pueblo communities to thrive where others might have faltered. Art remained a vital medium of connection and remembrance. Pottery and textiles incorporated Kachina symbols, spiral motifs, and images of animals and celestial bodies. Each creation was a form of storytelling, a preservation of history, and a plea for divine favor. Murals in kivas depicted ancestral journeys, weaving together memories of the cliffs, the migration, and the new life along the river valleys. Every artistic stroke carried meaning, linking the individual, the community, and the spiritual universe in an intricate web of understanding. Yet challenges persisted. Droughts still threatened crops, predators stalked fields, and conflict occasionally arose with neighboring tribes. The spiritual life of the Pueblo people was a source of resilience. Ceremonies reinforced social bonds, teaching patience, humility, and mutual respect. The Kachinas reminded the people that balance, in thought, action, and community, was the key to enduring hardship. Kiva, now a recognized spiritual guide, embodied the continuity of memory and adaptation. He led rituals, interpreted visions, and mediated disputes, all while teaching the younger generation the wisdom of the cliffs and the rivers. He reminded the people that the land itself was sacred, that every stone, every river, every gust of wind carried ancestral guidance. His presence ensured that the culture remained cohesive even as the community expanded, adapted, and faced the uncertainties of life in a challenging land. The Kachinas, the ceremonies, and the spiritual practices were not mere tradition. They were lifelines. They bound the people to each other and to the land, preserved memory, guided survival, and fostered identity. Through them, the Pueblo people honored the journey of their ancestors from northern cliffs to fertile valleys, blending past and present in a living culture. As night fell over the settlements, fires glowed in the plazas and kivas alike. Drums and flutes resonated, and masked dancers moved through the circles of the faithful. Kiva watched from a distance, heart swelling with a mixture of pride and reverence. The Kachinas were present, not only in masks and movements, but in the wind, in the rivers, in the lives of every person who honored the traditions. The spirits, the people, and the land were inseparable, forming a triad that ensured continuity, prosperity, and resilience. And so, the Pueblo world thrived. Through ceremony, artistry, and spiritual devotion, the people transformed the lessons of the cliffs into a culture uniquely their own. They carried memory forward, navigated survival with wisdom, and created communities that resonated with life, reverence, and harmony. In every stone, in every dance, in every whispered prayer, the spirit of the Anasazi endured, living in the heartbeats of a people who had found home in the embrace of rivers, skies, and sacred stones. The morning sun cast long shadows across the terraced villages, illuminating adobe walls, terracotta rooftops, and carefully cultivated fields. Life in the Pueblo communities had grown complex, yet it retained the harmony that had guided the Anasazi from the cliffs to the river valleys. Families were the foundation of society, and the rhythm of daily life intertwined labor, ritual, education, and community engagement. From sunrise to sunset, every action reinforced the social fabric, sustaining both survival and culture, and households were often extended, encompassing multiple generations under one roof. Walls were thick with adobe and stone, offering shelter against sun, wind, and winter chill. Roofs served as working platforms, drying corn, repairing pottery, or observing the skies. Within, rooms were designated for sleeping, storage, and ceremonial purposes. Each family contributed to the community's well-being through labor, craftsmanship, and participation in rituals. Women managed agriculture, weaving, pottery, and food preparation, while men hunted, maintained irrigation systems, and crafted tools. Children learned by observing and assisting, gradually assuming responsibilities appropriate to their age and skill. Hierarchy was fluid yet functional. Elders held authority in matters of ceremony, dispute resolution, and strategy, while skilled artisans and knowledgeable farmers gained respect through expertise. Leadership was not centralized. Councils guided decisions, ensuring consensus and shared responsibility. Social structures encouraged collaboration rather than domination, a reflection of the survival lessons passed down from the cliffs. Each member of the community understood their role and how it contributed to the larger balance between people, land, and spirit. Education was integrated into daily life. Children learned to read the signs of the sky, rivers, and soil while helping in fields or tending livestock. They observed elders crafting pottery, carving masks, and maintaining kivas, absorbing techniques and symbolism. They were taught the sacred stories of the cliffs, the migration, and the spirits that guided them. Storytelling occurred not only in kivas, but in the quiet moments of domestic life, beside fires, in plazas, and along trails to neighboring villages. These stories reinforced ethical values, practical knowledge, and spiritual awareness, ensuring continuity of culture through oral tradition. Agriculture remained central. Corn was the primary crop, planted in carefully spaced rows and rotated with beans and squash to maintain soil fertility. Irrigation systems were monitored daily, with canals cleaned, ditches repaired, and reservoirs replenished. Crop festivals marked the cycles of planting and harvest, with music, dance, and offerings to ensure prosperity. Children participated eagerly, learning to honor the land while contributing to sustenance. The successes and failures of each season were interpreted spiritually, a reminder that human effort and divine favor were intertwined. Trade and interaction with neighboring tribes introduced new goods, ideas, and challenges. Villagers exchanged pottery, woven cloth, corn, and ceremonial objects for obsidian, turquoise, and exotic foods. These exchanges reinforced social bonds and encouraged cultural enrichment. Kiva, now a respected figure in both ritual and civic life, often acted as a mediator and guide in these interactions, ensuring that respect and tradition were maintained while embracing beneficial innovations. Trade brought not only material wealth but also knowledge, shaping the Pueblo world into a networked, adaptable civilization. Daily life was punctuated by rituals. Sunrise prayers greeted the day. Offerings of cornmeal, feathers, and water were placed at altars to honor spirits. Kivas served as centers for education, meditation, and spiritual reflection. Festivals combined the sacred and communal. Masked dances celebrated celestial events, the changing seasons, or successful harvests. Music filled the plazas, drums and flutes echoing in harmony with the movements of the dancers. Each ritual reinforced collective identity, linking individual action to community welfare and cosmic balance. Art and craftsmanship were essential components of daily life. Pottery, baskets, textiles, and carvings were not only functional, but imbued with symbolic meaning. Spirals, handprints, animal motifs, and celestial patterns adorned every object, connecting the maker and user to ancestral knowledge. Pottery was fired carefully in outdoor kilns, colors and designs reflecting spiritual as well as aesthetic choices. Woven mats and garments incorporated both practical durability and symbolic representation, conveying status, identity, and reverence. These artistic practices were integral to education and ritual, teaching children patience, precision, and respect for tradition. Conflict was rare but managed effectively. Resource disputes, interpersonal disagreements, and external threats were addressed through council deliberations. Elders mediated with wisdom and patience, emphasizing restitution and harmony over retribution. Ceremonial observation, divination, and interpretation of omens often inform decisions, blending spiritual guidance with practical governance. This approach maintained cohesion and stability, allowing communities to flourish even amid environmental challenges or neighboring pressures. Spiritual life permeated all aspects of existence. The Kachinas, river spirits, mountain guardians, and ancestral forces were invoked not only in ceremonies, but in daily interactions. Children learned to offer thanks before meals, prayers accompanied work in fields, and guidance was sought in moments of uncertainty. Spirituality and survival were inseparable. Understanding natural rhythms, honoring forces beyond sight, and maintaining ethical behavior were all essential to prosperity and well-being. Family gatherings were also times of reflection, storytelling, and celebration. The elders recounted the migration from the northern cliffs, teaching children about perseverance, courage, and respect. Stories of drought, hardship, and triumph reminded the younger generation that survival required wisdom, adaptability, and reverence for the land. Through these narratives, the essence of the Anasazi endured, integrated into daily life and future planning. Kiva often walked among the villages at dusk, observing families at work and play, listening to children laugh and elders converse. He reflected on how far the people had come, from cliff dwellers facing unrelenting drought to a network of thriving, spiritually attuned communities in fertile valleys. The lessons of survival, memory, and innovation were embodied in each household, each field, and each ceremonial space. He recognized that the strength of the Pueblo people lay not only in their skills or resources, but in their ability to harmonize daily life with spiritual, social, and environmental wisdom. By nightfall, fires glimmered in every village. Smoke curled skyward, carrying offerings and prayers to the unseen. The children slept under thick adobe walls, dreaming of ancestors, kachinas, and spirals of memory. The elders rested with the satisfaction of a day well lived and a culture thriving. The Pueblo communities, rooted in family, guided by ritual, and balanced with the land, had created a resilient civilization. They honored the past while innovating for the future, weaving together survival, spirituality, and social cohesion into a tapestry of life that would endure for generations. And thus, the Pueblo world thrived, a testament to human ingenuity, adaptability, and reverence for the cycles of nature. In every field, in every home, in every song and story, the legacy of the Anasazi lived on, transformed yet eternal, a bridge between cliffs and valleys, past and present, mortality and spirit. The rivers ran lower that year, the soil cracked under the relentless sun, and the fields of corn, beans, and squash began to wither. A whisper of worry spread through the villages, a familiar tension that had been felt in countless seasons before. The Pueblo people had known droughts before, remembered the long journeys from the northern cliffs, and carried the stories of ancestors who survived famine and scarcity. Yet each new challenge demanded ingenuity, vigilance, and spiritual fortitude. The land was both giver and teacher, rewarding care and punishing neglect. Kiva walked among the terraces, observing the furrows where seedlings struggled to sprout. The elders had convened at the largest kiva in the valley, a circular space carved into the earth with walls painted in spirals, suns, and rain motifs. Here, council and ceremony intertwined. The people prayed for guidance while evaluating the state of their reservoirs, irrigation canals, and fields. Every drop of water was precious, every decision measured. In these moments, survival was not only physical, but spiritual. They sought the wisdom of both the living and the departed, asking for insight from the Kachinas, the ancestral spirits, and the forces of nature. Water management became the immediate priority. Canals that carried river flow to distant terraces were inspected, repaired, and expanded. Reservoirs were cleaned and deepened, while small catchment basins were dug to trap runoff from hillsides. The people practiced rationing, sharing water between households and villages, according to need. Women coordinated the distribution of water for cooking, cleaning, and irrigation, while men repaired channels and monitored the river's course. Children learned the delicate balance of conserving this vital resource, understanding that survival required attention to detail and collective responsibility. Agricultural strategies adapted to the harsh conditions. Farmers experimented with planting denser rows, intercropping drought-resistant varieties, and using natural mulch to retain soil moisture. They observed the clouds, the wind, and the position of the sun to predict the arrival of rains. Techniques inherited from the cliffs were refined, blending experience, observation, and innovation. Even in scarcity, the people maintained rituals of gratitude and reverence, offering thanks for what little water arrived and invoking blessings for the next rainfall. Social cohesion was tested but strengthened by these trials. Families depended on each other for labor, advice, and support. Villages coordinated planting and harvest schedules to maximize efficiency and reduce waste. Decisions were made collectively in councils, guided by elders whose memory stretched across decades of experience. Disputes over resources were resolved through negotiation, storytelling, and ritual, reminding the people that the survival of the community outweighed individual desire. In these moments of shared challenge, bonds deepened, and the wisdom of cooperation became evident. Spiritual life became a source of hope and resilience. Kiva led ceremonies in which dancers, adorned with masks representing rain spirits, thunderbirds, and ancestral guides, invoked blessings from the unseen world. Drums and rattles echoed through the valleys, carrying prayers to mountains and rivers. Offerings of cornmeal, feathers, and pottery were placed in Kiva fire pits, symbolizing humility and respect. Children watched intently, learning that even in hardship, gratitude, discipline, and faith were essential tools of survival. These rituals reinforced not only belief, but social cohesion, reminding everyone that their fates were intertwined with both community and cosmos. Trade became strategic. Scarce resources were shared with neighboring villages and tribes, creating networks of mutual aid. Pottery, cloth, and ceremonial items were exchanged for obsidian, food, and livestock. These relationships were carefully maintained, balancing diplomacy and self-preservation. Knowledge traveled alongside goods, techniques for water conservation, medicinal herbs, and agricultural strategies spread across communities. Through trade, the Pueblo people reinforced the resilience of the entire region, ensuring that no village faced drought in isolation. Education during this period emphasized practical knowledge and adaptability. Children learned to plant in dry soil, repair irrigation channels, and store food efficiently. They observed the elders' ceremonies, understanding the spiritual dimension of survival. Storytelling included cautionary tales of failed crops and unheeded warnings, embedding lessons in memory and imagination. Young people internalized the balance of caution, observation, and faith, ensuring that the next generation would inherit both knowledge and wisdom. Art and ritual reflected the challenges of the land. Pottery patterns incorporated symbols of rain, clouds, and rivers, reminding the people of the forces that sustained life. Spirals became motifs not only of ancestry, but also of the cyclical struggle with scarcity and abundance. Kiva murals depicted clouds, thunderbirds, and rain spirits, a visual lexicon reinforcing hope and resilience. Even the most utilitarian objects carried meaning, blending function, beauty, and spiritual significance. Kiva often reflected on the lessons of the cliffs during these trying times. The memory of ancestors who endured drought and migration informed every decision. The people's success depended on respect for nature, careful observation, innovation, and cooperation. Scarcity was a test of character and community, a reminder that survival was never guaranteed, but achievable through diligence, reverence, and unity. As months passed, the rains returned in small, cautious waves. Reservoirs filled, rivers regained volume, and seedlings sprouted anew. Festivals celebrated not only the abundance, but also the perseverance that had carried the people through hardship. Music, dance, and song marked the renewed fertility of the land. Gratitude was offered to the Kachinas, the ancestral spirits, and the river that sustained life. Each success reinforced the intertwined nature of survival, spirituality, and social cohesion. The lessons of drought extended beyond immediate survival. Communities learned to anticipate environmental changes, to plan collectively, and to respect the limits and gifts of the land. Memory of scarcity became embedded in ritual, art, and social structure, ensuring that future generations would carry both the stories and the strategies needed to endure. The people had learned that resilience was not simply endurance, but wisdom applied to every facet of life, spiritual, social, and practical. By the end of this challenging season, the Pueblo communities emerged stronger. Water management, communal labor, trade, and spiritual observance had preserved life. The memory of the cliffs, the lessons of ancestors, and the guidance of Kachinas ensured continuity. Families remained interconnected, rituals maintained balance, and the land, though harsh, continued to provide. The Pueblo people had transformed adversity into wisdom, scarcity into discipline, and challenge into cultural cohesion. Night fell over the valleys, stars shimmering above the terraces and kivas. Fires glowed softly in homes and ceremonial spaces, casting dancing shadows on adobe walls. Kiva walked among the settlements, heart steady with the knowledge that the people had not merely survived. They had learned, adapted, and preserved the spirit of the Anasazi. In every field, every kiva, every story told at dusk, the lessons of drought and resilience were etched into memory. The land had tested them, and they had answered with wisdom, unity, and reverence, a legacy that would endure for generations. The valleys stretched wide under the brilliance of the sun, their rivers winding like silver threads through terraces of green. In the Pueblo settlements, life had entered a rhythm of stability and cultural richness. Years of adaptation, survival, and spiritual devotion had transformed the people from migrants fleeing drought-stricken cliffs into thriving communities that balanced practicality with reverence, innovation with tradition. Every element of daily life now reflected a deep understanding of their environment and a vibrant cultural identity that drew from both memory and experience. Trade networks had expanded significantly. Paths carved through mesas, valleys, and mountain passes linked villages across vast distances. Pottery, woven cloth, and ceremonial masks were exchanged for turquoise, obsidian, shells, and salt from distant lands. Trade was not merely transactional. It was a conduit of knowledge, artistic influence, and diplomacy. Through these interactions, the Pueblo people refined their techniques in pottery and weaving, incorporating new patterns, colors, and methods observed from neighbors and traveling artisans. Every traded item carried stories, history, and innovation, a symbol of the interconnectedness of the communities. The art of the Pueblo people flourished during this period. Pottery became increasingly sophisticated, with intricate geometric designs, depictions of animals, and symbolic motifs representing the spiritual world. Spirals, suns, clouds, and Kachina symbols adorned bowls, jars, and ceremonial vessels. These objects were used in everyday life, in rituals, and as offerings, serving both practical and sacred purposes. Textile weaving reached new heights, with patterns that recorded history, conveyed social status, and communicated spiritual messages. Even baskets and mats, though utilitarian, carried symbols and decorations that reinforced identity, and connection to the land. Architecture continued to evolve. Terraced multi-storied homes, built with adobe and stone, offered stability and protection. Roofs doubled as workspaces and ceremonial platforms. Central plazas hosted markets, dances, and communal gatherings, reinforcing social cohesion. Kivas remained the spiritual nucleus, their circular design fostering community participation and reflection. Murals depicting celestial bodies, ancestral journeys, and sacred animals adorned Kiva walls, teaching children the stories of their people while inspiring awe and reverence. Every stone placed, every wall built, was an act of cultural expression, a blend of practicality and artistic vision. Daily life was both rigorous and rhythmic. Fields required constant attention, irrigation channels needed maintenance, and the storage of food and water demanded foresight. Yet within this labor lay beauty and meaning. Children assisted elders in planting and harvesting, learning the cycles of nature. Women shaped clay, spun fibers, and prepared food, infusing each task with ritual significance. Men maintained terraces, hunted, and crafted tools, understanding that their work supported the larger community. Every action reinforced social bonds and cultural continuity, demonstrating the delicate balance between survival and artistry. Ceremonial life grew increasingly elaborate. Seasonal festivals marked solstices, equinoxes, first planting, and harvest, each blending music, dance, ritual, and communal participation. Kachina dances brought the spiritual world into tangible presence, with masked dancers embodying ancestral and natural forces. Drums, rattles, and flutes created rhythms that echoed across the valleys, guiding movements that mirrored celestial patterns and natural cycles. Offerings of cornmeal, feathers, and crafted objects were placed in fire pits and ceremonial spaces, symbolizing gratitude, humility, and the perpetual dialogue between humans and spirits. Education intertwined daily survival with spiritual and cultural transmission. Children learned agricultural techniques, craftsmanship, and water management, while also absorbing rituals, storytelling, and spiritual practices. Elders emphasized observation and reflection, teaching youth to interpret signs in the clouds, rivers, and stars. Storytelling in plazas, kivas, and homes conveyed ethical lessons, ancestral memory, and cautionary tales. Knowledge was holistic, encompassing practical skill, moral guidance, and spiritual awareness, ensuring that each generation inherited a fully integrated understanding of life in the valleys. Conflict, though infrequent, was managed through diplomacy, ritual, and council deliberation. Disputes over resources or territory were resolved through negotiation guided by elders, with spiritual observances providing insight and reinforcing social cohesion. The Pueblo people understood that survival and prosperity depended not only on individual action, but on collective harmony. Even trade, with its potential for misunderstanding, was approached with care, observation, and respect, ensuring that alliances endured and relationships strengthened across regions. The spiritual life of the people infused the mundane with meaning. Every meal, every harvest, and every task carried an element of ritual. Offerings were left at kivas, riverbanks, and terraces, honoring the kachinas, ancestral spirits, and natural forces. Ceremonies were woven into the fabric of everyday life, linking practical labor with cosmic significance. Music and dance became conduits for storytelling, teaching, and communal bonding, with rhythms echoing the heartbeat of the land itself. In these practices, survival was inseparable from culture, and culture inseparable from spirituality. Communal identity solidified during this period. Villages, though dispersed across valleys and mesas, shared traditions, ceremonies, and values. Trade, ritual, and shared challenges reinforced a sense of belonging, while art, architecture, and storytelling preserved memory and encouraged innovation. Families were the nucleus of this identity, passing knowledge from one generation to the next, teaching children the ethics, skills, and spiritual awareness required to sustain the community. Within this network, individuals understood their role not merely in survival, but in perpetuating a civilization that honored both ancestors and the land. Kiva reflected on the transformation he had witnessed. From the fragile beginnings in the wake of drought and migration, the people had built a resilient, sophisticated culture. The memories of the cliffs, the wisdom of ancestors, and the guidance of the Kachinas had become living forces in their lives. Communities thrived not simply because of resources or numbers, but because every action, agricultural, artistic, social, and spiritual, was imbued with knowledge, foresight, and purpose. Night fell across the valleys, fires glowing softly in plazas, homes, and kivas. The music of drums, flutes, and chants carried across terraces, mingling with the scent of roasting corn and the distant sound of flowing rivers. Children slept under adobe roofs, dreaming of ancestors, Kachinas, and the future of their people. Elders watched with satisfaction and reverence, knowing that the Pueblo world was thriving. The land had been tamed but not conquered. It had been honored and understood. The legacy of the Anasazi continued, alive in every vessel, every mural, every ceremonial chant. The Pueblo people had created a culture of balance, survival intertwined with spirituality, labor infused with art, memory guiding innovation. In every stone placed, every seed planted, every story told, they preserved a connection to the past while shaping the future. The civilization that had emerged from the cliffs of the north was now firmly rooted in the river valleys, vibrant, enduring, and profoundly human. The Pueblo villages sprawled across the river valleys, terraced homes rising like clusters of amber stones against the backdrop of mesas and mountains. Paths connecting settlements were well worn, carrying traders, travelers, and messengers who wove the tapestry of a complex, interlinked civilization. Life had grown prosperous, with thriving agriculture, elaborate art, and intricate rituals. Yet the expansion of communities brought new challenges. Encounters with neighboring tribes, competition over resources, and the delicate task of preserving cohesion within a growing society. Trade routes were essential arteries, linking distant villages and facilitating exchanges of goods, ideas, and cultural practices. Pottery adorned with Kachina motifs, ceremonial masks, woven textiles, and harvested crops traveled from village to village, reaching communities hundreds of miles away. In return, turquoise, obsidian, shells, and exotic foods arrived, enriching local culture and reinforcing alliances. These interactions were generally peaceful, based on reciprocity and mutual respect. Yet the wealth and resources of thriving villages attracted envy and occasional aggression from outsiders, demanding careful diplomacy and vigilance. Encounters with neighboring tribes were multifaceted. Some tribes shared common ancestry or spiritual understanding, while others were distant relatives with different customs and rivalries. Ambassadors, elders, and respected warriors negotiated boundaries, trade terms, and ceremonial exchanges. Misunderstandings or missteps could escalate into conflict, yet Pueblo diplomacy emphasized observation, patience, and respect for ritual. Kiva, now an elder, frequently mediated these interactions, ensuring that relationships reinforced security, prosperity, and spiritual harmony. Ceremonial gifts, offerings, and shared rituals often prevented tensions from turning violent, transforming potential threats into opportunities for alliance and cultural exchange. The expansion of villages also required careful internal management. Larger communities demanded coordinated labor, effective resource allocation, and shared responsibility. Council meetings became more frequent and formalized, with representatives from multiple households discussing irrigation, harvests, construction projects, and conflict resolution. Elders guided decision-making, blending memory, experience, and spiritual insight to ensure that choices served both practical and cultural needs. Leadership was not authoritarian, but consultative, with consensus prioritized over individual ambition. The system allowed villages to grow without fracturing, reinforcing the values of cooperation and collective well-being passed down from the cliffs. Environmental pressures continued to test the people. Periodic droughts, shifting river courses, and soil depletion required constant attention and adaptation. Fields were rotated, irrigation canals expanded, and reservoirs deepened. Communities implemented contingency plans, storing surplus food and water to weather lean seasons. In times of scarcity, cooperative labor intensified, with families working together to ensure equitable distribution. Spiritual observances remained central. Offerings, prayers, and ceremonies invoked rain, fertility, and protection. The Pueblo people understood that survival depended on harmonizing human effort with environmental cycles and divine forces. Conflict, when it arose, was rarely violent, but strategically managed. Minor disputes over land, hunting grounds, or trade were mediated through councils, ritual consultation, and negotiation. Elders interpreted omens, consulted the kachinas, and emphasized reconciliation. When necessary, warriors defended the village, but force was used sparingly, reserved for immediate threats. This measured approach preserved lives, reinforced social cohesion, and maintained cultural continuity, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of human dynamics and communal stability. Rituals evolved to reinforce cohesion during times of expansion. Large seasonal festivals brought together multiple villages, creating opportunities for shared celebration, diplomacy, and the reinforcement of cultural norms. Music, dance, and storytelling became instruments of unity, reminding participants of their shared history, values, and spiritual obligations. Children and adults alike absorbed lessons in morality, memory, and social responsibility, ensuring that cultural identity remained intact even as communities diversified and expanded. Artistic expression mirrored these complexities. Pottery patterns incorporated both local symbols and designs observed through trade. Murals in kivas depicted not only ancestral migrations and kachina spirits, but also communal achievements and notable events, preserving memory and guiding future generations. Weaving and basketry integrated motifs representing alliances, celestial cycles, and environmental awareness. Every creation carried multiple layers of meaning, blending function, aesthetics, and cultural education. Art became both a record of history and a medium for social cohesion, reinforcing identity and values in a tangible form. Family life remained central to stability. Households were organized to optimize labor, education, and ritual participation. Extended families lived together, pooling resources and sharing responsibilities. Women managed food, textiles, and ritual preparation. Men oversaw construction, water management, and defense. Children were trained in both practical skills and spiritual awareness, participating in work, ceremonies, and storytelling. Elders ensured that each generation inherited not only technical knowledge, but the ethical and spiritual frameworks that sustained the Pueblo way of life. Despite challenges, the Pueblo people continued to thrive. Expansion brought diversity, new ideas, and material wealth, yet it also required vigilance, coordination, and cultural reinforcement. The legacy of the cliffs, lessons in cooperation, observation, and respect for the land, remained central. Communities had learned to balance innovation with tradition, growth with cohesion, and survival with spirituality. At dusk, fires flickered across terraces and plazas, smoke carrying prayers to the mountains and rivers. Drums, rattles, and flutes echoed softly through the valleys, accompanying masked dancers whose movements evoked rain, fertility, and ancestral guidance. Kiva walked among the gathering, observing families, traders, and children, knowing that the community had achieved not only survival, but identity, unity, and resilience. The Pueblo people had transformed the lessons of the past into a living civilization, capable of adapting to new challenges while preserving memory and spirit. In every stone wall, every ceremonial vessel, and every song, the presence of the Anasazi endured. Expansion and encounters had tested the community, yet through diplomacy, ritual, and social cohesion, they had maintained a civilization that balanced practicality, spirituality, and cultural integrity. The river valleys thrived not just because of fertile soil or water, but because of the wisdom, foresight, and reverence embedded in the hearts of the people. The Pueblo civilization had become a mosaic of resilience, artistry, and communal strength. From the cliffs to the valleys, from ancestral memory to innovative practice, they had created a world where survival, culture, and spirituality were inseparable. In every festival, every trade, every Kiva gathering, the echoes of the lost cliffs resonated, a living testament to the enduring spirit of the Anasazi. The sun rose over the river valleys with an intensity that seemed to illuminate every adobe wall, every terrace, and every stone path carved by generations of careful hands. The Pueblo communities had grown in size, sophistication, and cultural depth. They had survived the trials of drought, migration, and external pressures, and in doing so, had reached a period of remarkable spiritual and artistic flourishing. Ceremonial life was now the lifeblood of identity, uniting people across villages, linking generations, and weaving together the lessons of survival with expressions of beauty, devotion, and memory. Kiva, now an elder with decades of experience and spiritual insight, observed the preparations for the annual winter solstice ceremony, the most important festival in the communal calendar. Long before the sun reached the horizon, villagers gathered in the central plaza, carrying offerings of corn, dried herbs, and intricately crafted pottery. Women adorned themselves with brightly colored textiles, each pattern telling a story of lineage, agricultural success, or sacred myth. Men prepared ceremonial implements, rattles, drums, carved staffs, and masks depicting kachinas, spirits of ancestors, animals, and natural forces. Children watched intently, their eyes wide with anticipation, learning not only the steps of the dance, but the weight of its meaning. The kivas, circular and subterranean, were elaborately decorated with murals depicting ancestral journeys, celestial bodies, and sacred animals. Each symbol carried layers of meaning. Spirals represented migration and continuity. Animals symbolized strength and guidance. And geometric patterns encoded knowledge of the seasons and agricultural cycles. The murals were more than art. They were a living memory, a map of history, and a guide for the future. Kiva moved from kiva to kiva, ensuring that each ceremonial space was ready, each ritual properly arranged, and each participant prepared to honor the spirits with integrity and focus. The dances began as the sun reached its zenith, rhythmic and deliberate. Drums and flutes set a heartbeat that mirrored the pulse of the land itself. Dancers, their bodies adorned with masks and painted designs, moved with precision, embodying rain spirits, thunderbirds, and ancestral guides. Every step, gesture, and chant was laden with meaning, a bridge between the material world and the spiritual. Kiva watched the children mimic the movements, recognizing that this was education in its purest form, the transmission of knowledge, values, and belief through embodiment rather than mere instruction. The ceremonies were also acts of diplomacy. Representatives from neighboring villages and tribes participated, exchanging gifts and reaffirming alliances. Turquoise, shells, and ceremonial pottery were offered and received with care, symbolizing mutual respect and shared spiritual and social understanding. These interactions reinforced cohesion, extended influence, and ensured that cultural practices remained vibrant even across distances. Through ceremony, art, and exchange, the Pueblo identity crystallized, uniting people through common values, sacred memory, and collaborative expression. Music and rhythm played a vital role in reinforcing communal identity. Drums and rattles echoed like the heartbeat of the earth, guiding dancers and invoking spiritual presence. Flutes carried melodic lines that told stories of creation, migration, and the cycles of nature. Chanting wove these elements together, blending individual voices into a collective expression of devotion and continuity. Even those not directly participating absorbed the music's message, understanding its function as a medium for memory, education, and cohesion. Art continued to flourish alongside ritual. Pottery vessels, now more sophisticated than ever, incorporated complex geometric patterns, depictions of ceremonial masks, and representations of celestial bodies. Baskets and woven mats were adorned with symbols that encoded history, spiritual guidance, and communal identity. Every artistic creation served multiple purposes: practical, spiritual, educational, and symbolic. In this way, the Pueblo people transformed their daily lives into acts of cultural preservation, linking the past with the present and future. The education of youth remained central to cultural continuity. Children actively participated in ceremonies, learning the sacred dances, chants, and rituals, while also assisting in daily work, craft, and agriculture. Elders narrated stories that blended history, morality, and spiritual guidance. Lessons were embedded in observation and practice: how to plant crops with reverence, how to carve masks with care, how to negotiate disputes with fairness, and how to honor ancestors in thought and action. Knowledge was holistic, inseparable from identity, and deeply embedded in both work and worship. Despite growth and complexity, the communities faced challenges. Environmental pressures persisted: occasional droughts, fluctuating river levels, and limited arable land demanded constant adaptation. Trade networks, while enriching, also brought competition and the potential for conflict. Yet the strength of Pueblo society lay in its integrated approach. Survival, spirituality, and social cohesion were inseparable, creating resilience and flexibility. The rituals and arts were not mere embellishments, but mechanisms for teaching, uniting, and guiding the people through uncertainty. Ceremonial leadership, embodied in figures like Kiva, balanced tradition with responsiveness. Elders interpreted omens, mediated disputes, and ensured that rituals were executed with precision. Leaders guided, but communities participated collectively, fostering a shared sense of responsibility and identity. The Kachinas, ancestors, spirits of animals, and natural forces, were ever present, invoked not only in major festivals, but in daily acts of planting, weaving, hunting, and crafting. Spiritual observance informed every decision, reinforcing ethical conduct and practical wisdom. As night fell, the winter solstice ceremony reached its zenith. Fires blazed in plazas and kivas, shadows dancing across murals and stone walls. Drums, rattles, and flutes intertwined in a complex rhythm, and dancers moved with grace and purpose, embodying the spiritual forces that governed rain, fertility, and prosperity. Villagers and visitors alike participated in the chorus of chants, prayers, and offerings. Children, having absorbed lessons of observation, repetition, and devotion, watched the culmination of their cultural heritage unfold. Kiva, standing on a raised platform, felt the heartbeat of the community as one with the pulse of the land. The apex of Pueblo culture was not marked by wealth or conquest, but by the integration of survival, art, ritual, and social cohesion. Each individual action, from planting corn to crafting a mask, from singing a chant to repairing an irrigation channel, contributed to a larger pattern of identity, resilience, and spiritual harmony. Memory of the cliffs, lessons from ancestors, and guidance of the Kachinas were embedded in every element of life, creating a civilization that was simultaneously practical, aesthetic, ethical, and sacred. Through these expressions, the Pueblo people had crystallized their identity. Expansion and prosperity had not diluted culture, but reinforced it, transforming the lessons of survival into enduring institutions of art, ritual, and communal life. The legacy of the Anasazi, perseverance, observation, cooperation, and reverence for the land had reached its fullest expression. In every stone, every mural, every drumbeat, and every dance, the spirit of the cliffs lived on, vibrant and eternal. As the night deepened, fires flickered, stars shimmered above mesas and valleys, and the songs of the winter solstice ceremony carried across the land. The Pueblo people, united in spirit and practice, had achieved a civilization that was both grounded in survival and soaring in cultural expression. They had transformed memory into action, hardship into wisdom, and daily life into a testament of human ingenuity, reverence, and enduring identity. The Pueblo settlements, once secure in the fertile valleys and mesas, began to sense subtle but persistent pressures from beyond their familiar lands. Distant tribes traveled through the high desert, seeking trade, water, or grazing territory for their livestock. Small disputes over hunting grounds or access to riverbanks occasionally flared, reminding the Pueblo people that isolation was no guarantee of peace. While diplomacy and ceremonial exchange often maintained harmony, the constant movement of peoples and the shifting balance of resources introduced uncertainty into what had long been a stable life. Environmental pressures intensified these challenges. Winters grew harsher in some valleys, and periodic droughts threatened crops even as trade routes provided relief. Floods occasionally washed out irrigation channels, leaving terraces barren for seasons. The Pueblo people had always adapted to fluctuations, but the frequency and severity of these environmental shifts required innovation and constant vigilance. Communities stored surplus corn, beans, and squash, carefully rotated fields, and deepened reservoirs. They practiced water rationing during lean years and relied on ritual observance to maintain spiritual harmony with the land. Every adaptation, however, reminded them that permanence was fragile and survival required vigilance and unity. Trade networks became simultaneously a source of opportunity and vulnerability. Villages welcomed visitors bearing obsidian, turquoise, shells, and ceremonial goods, but the movement of outsiders also introduced unfamiliar customs, diseases, and the potential for conflict. Leaders like Kiva balanced openness with caution, ensuring that hospitality did not compromise safety. Ceremonies and shared festivals became venues for both exchange and assessment, reinforcing alliances while observing intentions. Diplomacy was intertwined with spiritual observance. Offerings, prayers, and rituals guided interactions as much as negotiation and practical reasoning. Population growth in the valleys increased pressure on resources. Families expanded, terraces grew crowded, and water became a contested necessity. Some households relocated to more remote mesas or established new settlements along smaller tributaries, bringing the challenges of isolation, resource scarcity, and construction. Migration required planning. Fields had to be surveyed, water sources evaluated, and defensive measures considered. Elders and council members carefully weighed the benefits of expansion against the risks of fragmentation, ensuring that new communities maintained cultural cohesion and spiritual observance. Migration was often undertaken with ceremony. Departing families carried sacred objects, seeds, and pottery, ensuring continuity of tradition. Elders performed blessings, invoking the kachinas and ancestral spirits for guidance and protection. The journey itself became a living lesson for children: how to navigate desert terrain, observe natural signs, and respect both land and unseen forces. The movement of people was not merely practical, but deeply spiritual, reinforcing identity even as communities dispersed across a wider landscape. Despite careful planning, tensions sometimes arose. Competition for fertile terraces, water sources, or hunting grounds occasionally led to skirmishes or disputes. Councils mediated these conflicts, combining spiritual insight with practical solutions. Elders reminded participants that cooperation and ritual observance were the foundation of survival. Resentment, haste, or disregard for custom could threaten entire settlements. Even when conflict was unavoidable, strategies emphasized protection and deterrence rather than destruction, reflecting the Pueblo emphasis on balance, foresight, and restraint. Cultural transmission remained central during this period of expansion and movement. Kivas, even in newly established settlements, were dug and decorated with murals reflecting ancestral memory, celestial patterns, and sacred animals. Rituals accompanied planting, harvesting, and ceremonial events, ensuring that the spiritual framework endured even as geography shifted. Children learned through participation, observing elders, and engaging in work, art, and ceremony. Knowledge of survival, agriculture, artistry, and ethics was embedded in every action, sustaining community identity despite physical relocation. Art and craftsmanship adapted to new conditions. Pottery incorporated regional influences observed through trade and migration, blending traditional motifs with innovative designs. Weaving and basketry reflected both practical needs and spiritual symbolism. Even temporary settlements featured decorated storage vessels, ceremonial masks, and textiles, demonstrating that cultural expression traveled alongside people, sustaining memory and identity. Artistic practice became a stabilizing force, linking new spaces with ancestral tradition and reinforcing communal cohesion. The spiritual dimension remained a guiding force. Offerings of cornmeal, feathers, and water were made at every significant landmark, from river crossings to mesa summits. Rituals invoked kachinas, animal spirits, and ancestral guides, providing protection and ensuring harmony with unseen forces. Elders taught that survival depended on more than physical skill or resource management. Spiritual attunement, ethical conduct, and communal responsibility were equally essential. Even in the face of uncertainty, faith and ritual provided direction, fostering resilience and continuity. By the end of the season, some communities had fully relocated to new mesas, establishing settlements that would endure for generations. Others remained in the original valleys, fortified by collective labor, irrigation management, and ceremonial observance. Migration, whether forced by necessity or guided by opportunity, demonstrated the Pueblo people's adaptability and strategic vision. They preserved identity through ritual, art, and storytelling, ensuring that the spirit of the cliffs and valleys remained alive, even in new landscapes. Nightfall brought a quiet reflection. Fires glimmered across terraces and plazas. Children slept beneath adobe walls, and elders contemplated the journeys and challenges yet to come. The pulse of the Pueblo civilization continued, rhythmic, steady, and resilient. Through migration, environmental pressure, and external encounters, the people had maintained cohesion, adapted to change, and preserved their spiritual and cultural heritage. The lessons of survival, innovation, and community endured, preparing them to meet future challenges while honoring the legacy of their ancestors. As decades passed, the river valleys that had once provided abundance began to show subtle signs of strain. Rainfall became less predictable, snowmelt from the distant mountains fluctuated, and the soil, worked for generations, showed signs of depletion. Terraces that had sustained crops for centuries needed constant repair, and even the deepest reservoirs sometimes failed to hold enough water. The people of the Pueblo settlements had survived droughts before, adapted to scarcity, and maintained complex irrigation systems. Yet the cumulative impact of population growth, environmental stress, and changing climate now required more than ingenuity. It demanded transformation. The elders convened councils with unprecedented urgency. Representatives from multiple villages gathered in central plazas and kivas to evaluate water sources, crop yields, and food storage. Disagreements arose. Some advocated migration to less populated mesas or distant valleys, while others emphasized strengthening the existing settlements through labor, ritual, and conservation. The kachinas were invoked for guidance, and dreams, omens, and visions were interpreted as counsel for decision-making. Spiritual practices, once primarily ceremonial, now served as a framework for survival strategy, integrating ethics, observation, and foresight into practical governance. Migration became an increasingly common solution. Families and entire households traveled to establish new settlements on distant mesas or along tributaries of the river. Such movements were complex, requiring careful planning. New terraces had to be constructed, irrigation channels dug, and water sources secured. Communities carried ceremonial objects, pottery, and sacred seeds, ensuring continuity of tradition. Elders oversaw rituals that blessed the land and the journey, invoking ancestral spirits for protection and guidance. Children learned survival skills and cultural practices simultaneously, absorbing the lessons of adaptation firsthand. Internal pressures, however, were not limited to the environment. Population growth, coupled with limited arable land, occasionally caused tension within communities. Disputes over terrace access, water allocation, and trade priorities tested the strength of councils and the authority of elders. While most disagreements were resolved through negotiation, ritual consultation, and collective deliberation, the underlying stress reflected the larger challenge. A society reaching the limits of its traditional infrastructure and requiring adaptation to sustain cohesion and identity. Trade continued to play a critical role in sustaining society, but it too faced complications. Scarcity in some regions prompted greater reliance on neighboring villages, while distant tribes sought to establish influence over valuable resources. Diplomacy became more delicate, blending negotiation, ceremony, and strategic exchange. Alliances strengthened some communities, yet exposed others to vulnerability when conflicts arose elsewhere. Leaders like Kiva emphasized observation, foresight, and collective responsibility, ensuring that trade reinforced rather than undermined social cohesion. Cultural expression persisted as both a stabilizing and adaptive force. Pottery, murals, and textiles reflected the challenges and transformations of the time. Designs incorporated symbols of water scarcity, celestial cycles, and ancestral guidance, blending practicality with spiritual meaning. Ritual dances, kachina ceremonies, and communal festivals reinforced identity, teaching younger generations to honor tradition while responding to environmental realities. Art and ritual became vehicles for resilience, providing continuity, guidance, and collective moral grounding. Education of youth remained central to societal stability. Children learned agricultural techniques tailored to dwindling water and soil fertility, observed elders performing complex ceremonies, and participated in communal labor. Knowledge was holistic. Survival skills were inseparable from cultural understanding and spiritual awareness. Storytelling became particularly significant during this period, embedding cautionary tales of scarcity, migration, and adaptation within the fabric of collective memory. These narratives ensured that lessons learned from both success and failure guided future generations. Despite resilience, the signs of societal strain were undeniable. Some terraces were abandoned, fields left fallow, and smaller outlying settlements dissolved. Migration and consolidation reshaped the demographic map, concentrating populations in more viable locations while maintaining cultural and spiritual continuity. Leaders carefully managed this process, prioritizing both survival and identity. Communities maintained kivas, ceremonial practice, and artistic traditions, even as physical landscapes shifted, demonstrating the Pueblo commitment to the integration of environment, culture, and spirituality. Conflict, though less frequent than in earlier eras, still arose. Competition over scarce resources occasionally led to skirmishes with neighboring tribes or within extended communities. Elders emphasized diplomacy, ritual mediation, and strategic negotiation over aggression. Warriors were prepared to defend settlements, yet force was rarely the first option. Cultural norms, spiritual guidance, and ethical principles shaped responses to threats, illustrating the Pueblo philosophy that survival depended on balance, foresight, and collective wisdom. By the close of this period, the Pueblo civilization had undergone significant transformation. While environmental pressures, migration, and population dynamics challenged traditional structures, the people had adapted, consolidating settlements, maintaining trade, and preserving ceremonial life. Memory of the cliffs, the guidance of kachinas, and lessons from elders continued to shape decision-making, ensuring that cultural identity persisted even amid structural change. Night fell over the valleys and mesas, fires flickering across terraces and kivas. Children slept beneath adobe roofs, lulled by the rhythms of drums, the scent of ceremonial offerings, and the presence of ancestors embedded in murals and stories. Elders reflected on the resilience of their people, understanding that the survival of the Pueblo way of life depended not only on labor and ingenuity, but on the integration of spirituality, ethics, and collective memory. The civilization had evolved, responding to external and internal pressures, yet its essence remained intact, a testament to human adaptability, foresight, and reverence for both land and spirit. By the time the sun rose over the valleys and mesas, the Pueblo people faced a reality that had been building for generations. Environmental pressures, population growth, and intermittent conflicts had slowly reshaped the landscape of their civilization. Some terraces lay fallow, reservoirs were partially dry, and distant mesas beckoned with the promise of new opportunities and fresh water. The once dense settlements were now part of a network of dispersed communities, each carrying fragments of ancestral knowledge, ceremonial practice, and cultural identity. The dispersal was neither sudden nor chaotic. Families, guided by elders and spiritual insight, migrated along traditional routes, carrying seeds, pottery, textiles, and ceremonial objects. Rituals marked every journey. Offerings of cornmeal, feathers, and water were made at river crossings, mesa summits, and sacred sites, invoking the guidance and protection of kachinas and ancestral spirits. Children learned the roots, the rituals, and the responsibilities of migration, ensuring that knowledge and cultural practice traveled with the people. Even as physical settlements shifted, spiritual continuity anchored their identity. Trade remained a crucial lifeline. Migrating groups maintained connections with distant villages, exchanging goods such as turquoise, shells, obsidian, and ceremonial artifacts. These networks not only provided material support, but reinforced alliances, knowledge exchange, and cultural cohesion. Elders interpreted dreams, celestial signs, and omens to guide trade routes and timing, ensuring that journeys were both practical and spiritually attuned. Communities that once thrived in valleys now prospered along mesas and tributaries, blending adaptation with preservation. Kivas continued to anchor communities, whether in old settlements or newly established ones. Subterranean ceremonial chambers were dug, decorated, and maintained as centers of spiritual practice, education, and governance. Murals told stories of migration, ancestral guidance, and cosmic patterns linking past and present. Seasonal ceremonies, dances, and kachina rituals were performed with equal dedication, reminding participants that identity was not tied to location, but to shared memory, practice, and ethical responsibility. The arts endured as vital cultural markers. Pottery, weaving, and basketry reflected both continuity and adaptation. Designs incorporated symbols of water scarcity, celestial cycles, and migratory journeys. Functional objects carried deep symbolic significance, teaching lessons of ethics, survival, and cosmology. Even in new settlements, artistic practice linked generations, preserved memory, and reinforced community bonds. Cultural expression became both a record of transformation and a guide for future generations. Environmental knowledge proved invaluable during dispersal. Elders taught younger generations to identify reliable water sources, assess soil quality, and observe seasonal changes. Agricultural techniques were adapted to each new location, with irrigation channels dug carefully, terraces constructed thoughtfully, and fields rotated to prevent exhaustion. Knowledge of plants, animals, and celestial patterns ensured that survival was both practical and sustainable. Spiritual practice remained intertwined with these observations, creating a holistic framework for life in changing landscapes. Conflict persisted, but was increasingly managed through diplomacy and ritual mediation. The expansion into new territories sometimes brought contact with other tribes, who had their own claims on land, water, or trade opportunities. Elders and council representatives negotiated boundaries, shared resources, and conducted ceremonial exchanges to maintain peace. Warriors were prepared for defense, yet restraint and foresight remained guiding principles. Even in moments of tension, social cohesion and cultural values shaped responses, emphasizing survival without sacrificing ethical or spiritual integrity. As dispersal continued, the essence of the Pueblo civilization endured. Families, villages, and regional networks adapted to shifting circumstances while preserving core identity. Ancestral memory, encoded in stories, murals, and ritual, provided guidance. The kachinas remained central to spiritual life, invoked in ceremonies, daily labor, and migrations alike. Children absorbed lessons of survival, morality, and communal responsibility, ensuring that cultural continuity extended beyond immediate circumstances. By night, fires flickered across terraces, kivas, and temporary campsites. The scent of roasted corn and burning herbs filled the air, accompanied by the soft cadence of flutes, rattles, and drum beats. Elders watched children learning dances and rituals, observing carefully to ensure that the knowledge of generations remained intact. Stories were told of the cliffs, the river valleys, and the journeys of ancestors, reminding listeners of origins, challenges, and achievements. Even as settlements dispersed, the collective memory anchored identity. The legacy of the Anasazi was no longer confined to any single valley or mesa. It lived in the resilience, creativity, and spiritual depth of the people, carried across landscapes through migration, ritual, art, and memory. Their experience demonstrated that civilization was not merely defined by location or population, but by the integration of survival, culture, and ethics. The lessons of cooperation, foresight, and reverence for both land and spirit continued to guide descendants, shaping societies long after the original settlements had transformed. In dispersed plazas, atop mesas, and along riverbanks, the Pueblo people nurtured life, knowledge, and spiritual practice. Communities thrived in new locations, blending adaptation with continuity. The lessons of the cliffs, the guidance of kachinas, and the wisdom of elders remained living forces, ensuring that the essence of the Anasazi endured. The civilization, though physically transformed, had achieved a profound continuity, leaving behind a legacy of resilience, artistry, spirituality, and human ingenuity that would resonate for generations. Even as the centuries passed, the echoes of the Anasazi civilization persisted across the mesas, valleys, and riverbeds they once inhabited. Their physical settlements might have shifted, eroded, or been abandoned, yet the cultural, spiritual, and artistic foundations they had established endured, shaping not only the descendants who remained in the region, but also the broader understanding of human ingenuity in the American Southwest. The Pueblo peoples who carried forward these traditions became living repositories of ancestral knowledge, bridging the past and present with continuity, reverence, and resilience. In dispersed villages, ceremonial life remained central. Kivas, often rebuilt and adapted to new surroundings, continued to function as both spiritual and educational spaces. Murals depicted ancestral migrations, kachina spirits, and celestial patterns, reminding participants of origins and cosmic order. Seasonal festivals, dances, and ritual performances persisted, ensuring that children and adults alike absorbed ethical teachings, practical knowledge, and spiritual guidance. The ceremonies were living lessons. They encoded values of cooperation, respect for the land, and the importance of memory, maintaining cohesion and identity across generations. The arts remained vibrant, reflecting both tradition and adaptation. Pottery, weaving, and basketry carried symbols of ancestral wisdom, environmental awareness, and spiritual insight. Designs incorporated geometric motifs, kachina imagery, and representations of migration routes, connecting craftwork with cultural history. Even when settlements were far from the original river valleys, these artistic expressions provided continuity, teaching both function and philosophy. Every basket, every ceramic vessel, every textile became a repository of ancestral memory, a tactile guide to ethics, cosmology, and survival. Oral tradition flourished alongside visual and material culture. Elders narrated stories of the cliffs, the river valleys, and the migrations that had preserved life through adversity. These narratives conveyed more than history. They encoded lessons in observation, morality, environmental stewardship, and communal responsibility. Children absorbed these stories, internalizing ethical principles while learning to read the natural world. In this way, knowledge that might have been lost through the physical dispersal of settlements was preserved through memory, ritual, and storytelling. Trade networks continued to function as conduits of cultural exchange, even as external pressures reshaped the landscape. Distant villages and tribes shared materials, ceremonial objects, and artistic techniques, creating a regional network of interdependence. Turquoise, obsidian, shells, and ceremonial pottery traveled across valleys and mesas, while knowledge of agricultural practices, irrigation techniques, and ritual observance spread alongside goods. This interaction reinforced the resilience of Anasazi-derived culture, enabling adaptation without losing identity. The spiritual framework of the Kachinas remained central. Invoked in daily labor, ceremonial performance, and migratory planning, the Kachinas provided guidance and ethical direction. Villagers believed that ancestral spirits watched over them, ensuring that survival, cooperation, and cultural observance remained intertwined. Spirituality was inseparable from practical life. Planting, harvesting, crafting, and conflict resolution all reflected adherence to moral and cosmological principles. The enduring influence of this spiritual system ensured cohesion, stability, and ethical continuity across generations. Education, both formal and informal, remained a cornerstone of cultural survival. Children learned practical skills, agriculture, weaving, hunting, pottery, within a framework of ritual and ethical instruction. Observation, participation, and storytelling merged into a holistic pedagogy. Elders emphasized that survival was not only a matter of resource management, but also of maintaining spiritual awareness, communal harmony, and respect for ancestral wisdom. Knowledge transmission, therefore, was both adaptive and preservative, allowing communities to navigate changing circumstances without losing their identity. External observers, arriving centuries later, marveled at the sophistication and resilience of Anasazi descendants. Archaeologists and historians studying cliff dwellings, ceremonial sites, and art recognized the ingenuity, foresight, and social cohesion embedded in these communities. Yet the most vivid evidence of the Anasazi legacy lay not in ruins, but in living culture. The festivals, crafts, stories, and spiritual practices of modern Pueblo peoples. Through them, the lessons of adaptation, resilience, and ethical living continue to resonate. The environment, too, remained a teacher. Descendants preserved knowledge of water management, crop rotation, and land stewardship, understanding that survival depended on observing natural cycles and maintaining harmony with the landscape. Sacred sites, springs, and mesas continued to be places of reverence, integrating spiritual observance with ecological wisdom. In this way, the legacy of the Anasazi became both practical and moral, shaping behavior and guiding communities through successive generations. Despite the passage of time, the Anasazi's influence persisted in profound ways. Settlement patterns, ceremonial calendars, artistic motifs, and social structures informed the development of Pueblo communities throughout the region. Ethical principles, cooperation, foresight, respect for the land, and integration of spirituality with daily life remained guiding forces. The survival of these cultural elements demonstrated that legacy was not measured merely in stone structures, but in the endurance of values, memory, and human ingenuity. As night fell over mesas and valleys, fires flickered across plazas and kivas. Children listened to the stories of their ancestors. Elders observed ceremonial preparations, and families carried out rituals that had endured for centuries. The pulse of the Pueblo people continued, steady and resilient, echoing the rhythm of rivers, wind through mesas, and the heartbeat of the land itself. In these practices, the spirit of the Anasazi endured, a civilization transformed, dispersed, yet profoundly influential, whose lessons in adaptation, art, and spirituality had been preserved through human memory and action. The Anasazi had left behind more than stone walls and pottery. They had created a blueprint for resilience, ethics, and cultural continuity. Their descendants, carrying the knowledge of cliffs, rivers, and ceremonial life, ensured that the civilization's influence remained alive. Across the American Southwest, the spirit of the Anasazi persisted in living communities, art, ritual, and story, an enduring testament to the ingenuity, foresight, and devotion of a people who had shaped both land and culture with extraordinary care. Centuries had passed since the first families carved terraces into the mesas and sculpted their homes into the cliffs. Yet the essence of the Anasazi civilization continued to resonate across the American Southwest. Though the cliff dwellings now stood silent, weathered by time and wind, the cultural, spiritual, and intellectual heritage of the people remained vibrant in the lives of their descendants. From the ceremonial dances of Pueblo villages to the intricate patterns of pottery and woven baskets, the Anasazi had left an enduring imprint that transcended geography, reminding all who encountered it of the power of resilience, community, and reverence for life. The final chapter of their story began not with conquest or decline, but with reflection on the journey that had shaped them. The Anasazi had emerged from arid lands, observing the cycles of sun, moon, and river with precision and care. They had learned to cultivate crops in precarious soil, to store water in ingenious reservoirs, and to construct dwellings that harmonized with the landscape. Each architectural choice reflected not only practical needs, but spiritual and communal values. Their civilization was a testament to ingenuity, a careful balancing of human ambition with respect for nature's limits. Society had flourished through cooperation and wisdom. Councils of elders mediated disputes, guided settlements, and ensured the cohesion of communities. Leadership was not defined by dominance, but by knowledge, ethical conduct, and spiritual insight. Ceremonial life, kivas, kachina rituals, and seasonal festivals bound people together across generations and settlements. These practices reinforced identity, transmitted ethical values, and maintained the delicate balance between human activity and the natural world. In every drumbeat, every chant, and every ritual, the pulse of the Anasazi civilization could be felt. Art and culture had immortalized memory. Murals depicted ancestral migrations, celestial phenomena, and the interplay between humans and spirits. Pottery, baskets, and textiles encoded stories, ethical lessons, and practical knowledge. Each object served multiple purposes: utility, education, and spiritual expression. Through these artifacts, generations preserved wisdom in forms that could survive the erosion of walls, the abandonment of terraces, and the passage of centuries. The legacy of creativity and innovation remained, a bridge connecting past and present. Migration and dispersal, once sources of anxiety and adaptation, became defining elements of the Anasazi legacy. Families carried traditions, rituals, and knowledge across mesas and valleys, ensuring continuity even when physical settlements shifted. These movements preserved not only survival, but identity, demonstrating that culture could transcend location. Spiritual observance, communal labor, and ethical responsibility became anchors in uncertain landscapes, reinforcing cohesion and resilience. The dispersed Pueblo communities became living proof that civilization's endurance relied on values and knowledge as much as on walls and terraces. The influence of the Anasazi extended beyond their immediate descendants. Archaeologists, historians, and cultural observers marveled at the sophistication of irrigation systems, architectural ingenuity, and social organization. Lessons in resource management, ethical governance, and environmental attunement offered insights for understanding human adaptation in challenging landscapes. Yet the true legacy lay not in scholarship, but in lived culture. The persistence of ceremonies, the wisdom of elders, and the integration of spirituality with daily life. Their story carried a universal resonance. The Anasazi demonstrated that human societies could thrive through observation, cooperation, and ethical engagement with the environment. They revealed that survival was inseparable from culture, art, and spiritual understanding. They illustrated the value of memory and continuity, showing that knowledge, once transmitted through ritual, storytelling, and craft, could endure across generations and changing circumstances. The civilization's greatest achievement was not permanence in stone, but the persistence of identity, values, and human ingenuity. Even in modern times, the echoes of their presence could be felt. Descendant Pueblo communities maintained ceremonial cycles, artistic practices, and spiritual observances rooted in Anasazi tradition. Their dances, kivas, and festivals remained living expressions of ancestral wisdom. Pottery and weaving continued to reflect ancient patterns and teachings. The land itself, shaped by generations of terraces, reservoirs, and pathways, carried traces of human care and ingenuity, offering lessons in sustainable interaction with environment. In every act of preservation, every recitation of story, and every ceremonial practice, the Anasazi legacy lived on. Reflection on their journey revealed profound lessons for humanity. The Anasazi had taught that resilience requires cooperation, foresight, and ethical conduct. They showed that survival and cultural flourishing depend on integrating practical knowledge with spiritual awareness, and that memory and storytelling are essential to continuity. Their art and ritual conveyed complex wisdom that transcended time, offering guidance for future generations. In a world often marked by rapid change and ecological uncertainty, the Anasazi story serves as a reminder that adaptation, reverence, and community are not optional but essential. As the sun set over mesas and valleys, the ruins of cliff dwellings cast long shadows across the landscape, silent witnesses to a civilization that had achieved remarkable harmony between human ambition, culture, and nature. Fires flickered in Pueblo villages, flutes and drums echoed through kivas, and children learned the dances, stories, and rituals of their ancestors. Through these living practices, the spirit of the Anasazi endured, eternal, adaptable, and profoundly influential. The civilization had transformed, dispersed, and adapted to countless challenges, yet its essence remained intact, a testament to human ingenuity, ethical responsibility, and spiritual depth. The lessons of the cliffs, the guidance of kachinas, and the wisdom of elders continue to shape human understanding of survival, community, and identity. Across the mesas, valleys, and riverbeds, the Anasazi civilization whispered its enduring message that culture, memory, and reverence for the land are the foundations upon which human life can thrive, a legacy not measured in stone alone, but in the living pulse of people, practice, and spirit that continues to echo through time.